The better it is.
Still hungover. Morning. How are you doing? Oh, gotcha. Yeah.
LSO or ETS, can we get the link emailed to the task force in regards to the stream? Awesome. Thank you. That was the gavel. That means we're starting. Welcome, everyone, to Sheridan, Wyoming. It's good once again to see a strong turnout for Blockchain Task Force. We're excited about the work that we have once again this year to move this industry forward and to make sure that we, particularly as the state of Wyoming, are not holding back innovative efforts in financial technology and in property management and in other blockchain-related technologies. This task force has already done a good bit of work, certainly over the past few years, and we've got some, I think, exciting pieces of legislation we're looking at this year. Before we get started and move to the agenda, I want to talk a little bit about protocol. In case you haven't been to one of these committee meetings, the way that we operate in a Wyoming Legislative Committee meeting is that we always work through the chair. So today I'll be chairing this meeting. Tomorrow, Representative Lindholm, my co-chairman, will be chairing the meeting. So when you are providing public testimony and public comment, which there will always be opportunity for every topic we discuss, please work through the chairman, address the chair, and be identified for questions and work through that process. It helps to ensure an orderly meeting. Mr. Chairman, before we get to roll call, is there anything else that you'd like to raise at this time? No, besides, yeah, I guess the Business Council brought over some treats. Besides the coffee and water brought over by Sheridan College, there's some treats from Queen Bee Honey, which is based out of Lovell, Wyoming. It's a local little candy shop, and it's over there from the Wyoming Business Council. They were cleaning up their setup at the State Fair and brought that over for all of us to share. It's awesome. It's from Wyoming. All things from Wyoming are better than elsewhere, so please stop and grab some. All right. So with that, can we call the roll, Ian?
Yeah. Senator Driscoll. Present. Senator Nethercott.
Present.
Representative Olson. Here. Representative Yin.
He is excused. Representative Yin sends his apologies. His flight was delayed enough that he missed his connecting flight, if I'm not mistaken, and will be rolling in at some point today, I think. We don't know quite when Representative Yin will get here, but we do understand that he's in Canada at this point in time, and lamenting the fact that he's not here in lovely Sheridan, Wyoming. All right, please continue, Ian.
Representative Western.
Here.
Ms. Long.
Here.
Mr. Cole. Here. Mr. Cotton. Here. And Lindholm. Here. Rothfuss.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Excellent. All right, the first thing we want to take a look at today are some task force updates. So these are topics that we're keeping track of, don't necessarily have any legislation tied to them, but let's work through these. And the first item on the agenda for discussion is the Bermuda Correspondence. I don't know that we have any updates on that, but Ian, if you can tell us where we're at and what we've heard.
Mr. Chairman, a letter was sent on behalf of the task force signed by the chairman on May 15th. It just indicated our vote from the May meeting where the task force voted to participate with Bermuda and try to work towards common goals with digital identity specifically. We have not heard since them, at least LSO has heard nothing since then, so there's no particular follow-up to that letter.
Excellent. Committee, any discussion? Representative?
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we sent out, and just as a discussion piece, we sent out this aspect because it's something that Bermuda has really been interested in. They reached out to our governor's office in regards to digital identity. And so we didn't really know what that looks like. And I don't think Bermuda does. It's one of those deep dives that we're going to have to do, and it's going to involve a lot of work. So we were kind of looking for a cooperation with the country of Bermuda. They might be a little busy right now, but hopefully in the future we can participate. But because as of right now, I think we're being ghosted. That's essentially it.
That's the technical policy term for what's going on exactly. Anyone else on the committee want to discuss this a little bit? It is a good opportunity to form a partnership, obviously, and they're interested in digital identities. That's one of the topics that we have on our agenda today or tomorrow, perhaps. But we'll have to keep working on that relationship and see if we can work together. Anything else, committee? Seeing none, let's move on to the next topic, which is the Token Taxonomy Act update and correspondence. This is or any other really federal legislation that's related to the work that we're doing. We did send a letter on this, and I believe we heard back from Representative Cheney on it. Who would like to tell us a little bit about where we're at with this? Ian, do you have anything to add? Please do.
Nothing specifically other than the task force letter did go out on May 23rd. We heard from Representative Cheney on June 5th. My research indicates that has not moved through Congress yet. It was assigned to committee and is sitting there. So I don't believe there's more action on that right now.
Coach.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as just kind of a follow-up in regards to what Ian stated, some of the language that we used, if you remember in that letter, was asking Representative Cheney to react in a forceful manner against that legislation. Because of the premise of that legislation, there were some good aspects to the Token Taxonomy Act, but it ultimately would have removed states' rights for being able to regulate ourselves. So we asked that she work diligently against it, and the wheels have fallen off that bus. So whether that's because of Rep. Cheney or not, either way, it's a good deal until Congress gets their act together on that kind of legislation. We do not want to see something like that move forward. So kudos to the task force and the staff and Rep. Cheney's office on giving the chairman the ability to reach out to her, and I think we helped.
Committee, any further discussion? Yeah, I agree. We need to make sure that we're monitoring that and that we do end up working to ensure that Wyoming can maintain flexibility and autonomy in this as we're moving forward. We don't want the feds holding us back at this point. Further discussion? All right, seeing none. Let's move on to the next point. Uniform Law Commission correspondence. Mr. Co-Chairman, we're actually going to table this topic until tomorrow. It's my understanding from former Senator Nicholas, who is the ULC liaison, that we'll have someone here to speak to this particular point on behalf of the Uniform Law Commission. So we'll wait until tomorrow morning and take that up first thing prior to the Wyoming Money Transmitter Act tomorrow, without objection. Up next, the Wyoming Hackathon. Who would like to give us an update on the Wyoming Hackathon? Ms. Long, would you like to tell us where we're at and encourage everyone here to attend?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. We are setting a new high watermark after last year where we raised more than $100,000 for the university and prize money for developers and had more than 400 developers register. We are well ahead of that this year. We are calling it the Wyoming Blockchain Stampede, and that is the task force meeting, which is the 19th and 20th of September, and then a developer conference on the 20th of September, and a business conference on the 21st. I may have gotten those two dates backwards. And the hackathon will run from September 20th to the 22nd in conjunction. It will be held this year at the new College of Engineering and Applied Sciences building instead of where we held it last year, which was the field house. And we already, without having had a significant campaign, already have 175 developers signed up. We are well ahead of last year, both in fundraising and in attendance. So everyone, please plan to attend. This is going to be quite an event, and we have an unbelievable group of folks. Last year we had Joe Lubin, who is one of the co-founders of Ethereum, and Patrick Byrne, CEO of Overstock.com, and Jeff Garzik, one of the Bitcoin core developers and co-founder of Block, as well as Eric Voorhees supported us, from CEO of Shapeshift. This year, it's a whole new crowd. We've got, although some of those are still sponsoring, our marquee speakers are Jesse Powell, who was here, CEO of Kraken, who was here at the last task force meeting in Jackson Hole, and Charles Hoskinson, one of the co-founders of Ethereum and co-founder of Cardano, who's now working with the UW Computer Science Department as well. And there will be 4 podcasters there. There will be a lot of press associated with this event. So plan to come to Laramie to the Wyoming Blockchain Stampede.
Thank you, Ms. Long, and I really do encourage everyone to attend. We'll also have our next task force meeting at the beginning, effectively, of the blockchain stampede in Laramie. So have an opportunity to attend the next one of these events, as well as participate in the stampede. Anyone else, Mr. Co-Chairman? Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just one of the cool aspects of having Charles Hoskinson there with IOHK is IOHK is now a Wyoming company because of the efforts of this task force. And that's a big deal. That's a big outfit. I mean, they own Cardano, Ethereum Classic, and on top of that, they're the multitude of projects that organization is involved with. It's something like 800 employees worldwide. Really awesome that this task force did that with no funds. We didn't hang a dollar out there. We didn't say, hey, come get it. We just created a regulatory footpath that obviously Charles Hoskinson, Jeremy Wood, those individuals really appreciate. So they're going to be there on top of the guys from Kraken will be there, who is still kicking the tires on the state of Wyoming. So if you see any of the Kraken guys, make sure to kick them in the shins and tell them to pull the trigger. Maybe not hard, sorry. Gently kick. So anyways, it's really exciting. And the Wyoming Hackathon last year was a really inspiring event to see all of these world thought leaders from this type of group converge on little old Laramie, Wyoming. And on top of that, we've got the Sandcastle Challenge now that's going to be part of that event. And that's a worldwide challenge for business developers with these new business ideas that come together. And there's one event that's hosted in North America, and the two companies that win that North America event automatically go on to the world competition in Dubai. That was scheduled for Phoenix, Arizona, because Phoenix is pretty cool, right? Not as cool as Laramie. Now it's in Laramie. So pretty excited that that's happening also. Really, we're moving and shaking on some stuff, and we've got some steam. It's not all bad news out of the legislature. So yeah, go to the blockchain stampede, which the governor is now also has a proclamation proclaiming that blockchain week, by the way. So make sure you're there in Laramie.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. All right. Anything else in WyoHackathon? Anything else from the committee to add? Seeing none. The next little update is just industry and economic development updates. This is a broad topic to see if we do have anything else along the lines of what Co-Chairman Lindholm was just discussing. Anything new that we should raise at this time? There may not be. Ms. Long, Mr. Kaufman, anyone have anything to add? Any news? Co-Chairman? This may be the shortest topic. It's looking like it. All right. Excellent. Then we'll move on. So we have a number of drafts that we'll be considering over the next few days. This first sortie of legislation at 9 a.m. Are some of the simpler requests we made and straightforward pieces of legislation, but we'll walk through each of these pieces of legislation, discuss them, take some testimony on each of them, and then potentially act on them unless we identify some problems or anything that we need to clean up on. So at this point in time, I'd ask, I don't know whether it's going to be Ian or Tamara. It's going to be Ian, okay. To start walking us through these pieces of legislation, with the first one is Select Committee on Technology Innovation, and a little bit of a background to that. This task force, this blockchain task force, was created through the Wyoming budget. That's why it exists as a budget amendment. We put it together. The budget amendments in Wyoming statute expire when the budget expires. So there's no authority for this task force to continue to exist as soon as we get to the next legislative session, effectively. Yeah, we just vanish. We poof. We understand that there's a lot more work to do. We're not going to get this process completed for the state of Wyoming by the next legislative session, and what we want to do is make sure that we have statutory authority to continue. We discussed at the last task force meeting the possibility of creating a select committee. Select committee then could be legislation that carries past a budget and can be effectively as long lasting as we choose for it to be. It has a separate budget when it goes into effect that way. And it's a different process, but basically making sure that this group or a group like it continues into the future. We call it technology innovation rather than blockchain specifically, because we know that we probably need to start branching out into a few other territories that aren't just blockchain, but again, builds on the work that we've done. So it would be inclusive of blockchain technology without being exclusive to it, as we currently are tasked. So with that, let's go through the bill as we have it constructed. I believe we have that right at the top of tab 3, committee. And Ian or Tamara, whichever one of you wants to walk us through it, please do so.
Mr. Chairman, Tamara Revley here with LSO. I'll take this one. In front of you should be 20 LSO 0056. It's working draft 0.5. And the committee's motion at the last meeting was to draft a bill that would create a permanent legislative committee. And it would be in addition to, we have several other select committees. It'd be a new one within Title 28. And there wasn't a lot of direction on the topics that the new committee should study, and that's reflected in the bill draft, so there's some room there to expand or refine. But the membership was in the motion. We have 3 members of the House, 3 members of the Senate, and so you'll see that. The first page is, you'll see the title, Creating the Select Committee on Technology Innovation, providing for appointment of members and executive branch liaisons, and providing an appropriation.
Briefly, for anyone who didn't see it on the way in, paper copies of these drafts are available right outside the door. Electronic copies are obviously available on the website for you to go through if you want to follow along. Please.
On the second page is the membership makeup of the committee. As I just mentioned, 3 members of the Senate, 3 members of the House. We did, in the drafting process, discussed some problems that come up when you have a membership that's chairmen that are elected by the committee itself. It's hard to convene the first meeting each year because there is no chairman yet. So one workaround around that is to have the president of the Senate and the Speaker of the House appoint the chairman of each respective chamber. And so that's how this is drafted. If that's something the committee wishes to change, we certainly can. On page 3, we have the duties in subsection B of the Select Committee. And those are pretty broad. They're to develop knowledge and expertise among its members regarding issues pertaining to technology innovation and develop and introduce legislation. Subsection 3 provides for the appointment of the governor branch liaisons. And so these are not full members of the committee. Again, this is a committee that can sponsor legislation, and really legislation is within the legislative branch of the separation of powers of government. So we do allow for 3 executive branch liaisons who aid, assist, and advise the committee and would be authorized to receive reimbursement in the same manner that this committee does. And so that continues on to page 4. Now, section 2 will allow for the committee to become in existence sooner than the bill would allow for. By the bill and our other committees, the way that they usually begin is on March 5th following each general election. Well, in order to speed that up a little bit, Section 2 provides for the appointment of a new committee within 30 days after the effective date of the act. Section 3 provides for an appropriation, and this appropriation is modeled on the appropriation that this blockchain task force received. The same amounts, $33,000 from the general fund for a 2-year period, and it may be used for salary, mileage, and per diem, and also for other expenses of the select committee that are authorized by management council. On page 5, subsection B is the $10,000 similar to we had in this committee for the governor's office liaisons. And finally, subsection 4 on page 6 provides that the act shall become effective immediately.
Excellent. All right, a little bit of background before opening it to the committee. We have a few different concepts that we use in the Wyoming legislature. This is a task force because it includes executive branch appointees that are in equal standing to the legislators on the task force. As such, due to separation of powers, we do not allow task forces to sponsor their own legislation. They can develop legislation, and then that legislation has to be sponsored in some other way, which may be by an individual legislator, or what we typically do is find the most appropriate committee, where, for example, we have a chairperson on the committee, one of these two, for example, or Senator Driscoll right down here. Is anyone not sharing it? So, Jared's not sharing anything. Anyway. Yeah, sorry to call him out like that. I know, poor guy. It's harsh. It's pretty harsh. So that gives us an opportunity then to have committee sponsorship, and those committees will then work the legislation. That's what we've done over the last few years, is hand off from this task force to either the Minerals Committee, the Corporations Committee, or the Judiciary Committee typically. This legislation is drafted in a different way so that it would have the authority to sponsor its own legislation and bring that legislation directly to the legislature. As such, the executive branch members would not be able to vote on that legislation in an equal fashion, again, based on the separation of powers. So it's a constitutional concept. Provides a little bit of background on why things are written the way they're written and a little bit different from now. With that, Tamara, anything else to add before we go to the committee? No. Committee, thoughts on this bill draft? First of all, maybe thoughts on the approach. Is this the way we want to go? Anyone have any concerns? Ms. Long.
Mr. Chairman, one thing I noticed in the drafting is that this is technology generally. May I propose that we would also in some way reference fintech specifically because of what we're building in the rest of the legislative package?
Okay. Thoughts on that point? Let's discuss that. Do we want to narrow it to fintech, or do we want to be inclusive of fintech and explicitly inclusive of fintech?
Mr.
Ms.
Chairman,
Long.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was thinking potentially amending every place where we said technology, adding the words and fintech, for example. But that may not be the optimal way to handle this. So it would be the latter. It would be specifically including fintech, just to call out that we are making a fintech effort in the state.
Right. Representative Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would support that idea. I think it's what I've been struggling with is just the name of the committee. I think we could make it a little more appealing, and that's actually a good way to do it. So one way to do it may be, I mean, technology is broad enough to encapsulate financial technology, but it could be something like the Select Committee on Digital and Financial Technology and Innovation, or Select Committee on Digital and Financial Technology Innovation, something that clearly calls out. Also, we're just doing a quick Google search of Committee on Technology. You know, I think when you look around the state, what it actually continues to, or the country, sorry, continues to populate are things like information technology. So it even, to me, it even sounds kind of outdated, but I think Select Committee on Digital and Financial Technology and Innovation sounds pretty slick, for lack of a better word.
Anyone else? Ms. Long?
Mr. Chairman, are we taking amendments? That sounds pretty good to me, so I was going to propose it.
Not yet. We'll go to
Okay.
public comment before we work the bill, but I think these are all things that we should be discussing at this point, just in general concept. Anyone else have any thoughts? Well, yeah, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I really like the idea of having a select committee because a lot of you have gone with us when we've sold this to another committee, and it's just such a bombardment, right? I mean, we had some big bills last session where we had to go to the minerals committee at like the last minute and dump on them some pretty revolutionary stuff. Thankfully, they've got a lot of trust in what this committee has done, but it's still tough for them to be able to get their heads wrapped around it, and it's still tough to be able to when you sell it to a committee. At that point, that's that committee's baby. So, for instance, Chairman Greer of Minerals, he was a good hand for us on the floor. But still, it's tough for him to be able to stand up and defend a piece of legislation that's essentially his baby at that point because his committee sponsored it. So I think there's really a lot of merit in this going forward as a select committee versus a task force, just for the purpose of sponsoring our own legislation and not having to worry about one more hurdle. There's benefits to that, but there's the negatives outweigh, in my opinion. The one thing that I would like the task force to think about, though, is the governor appointees. I think having that outside industry help there's huge merit there. We wouldn't have accomplished what we've accomplished. But the governor's office appoints a lot of people to a lot of different groups, a lot of different committees and task forces, and they're swamped. It's tough. I don't think we've ever had it where the Speaker of the House appointed liaisons from the industry or the President of the Senate, but maybe we might want to think about language of having the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House work on appointing those three individuals instead of the governor's office, because the governor's office is pretty swamped, as we saw even with this task force. It was a last-minute appointment that happened, and it was pretty late it's not nothing against the governor's office. It's just they've got so much to do. So something to think about after we get done with public comment.
Any other discussion? So I'm going to throw out kind of the counter side of this, not necessarily because I don't support this legislation, but because I want us to think about it. Chairman Lindholm just mentioned the fact that in the past we've had to have other standing committees carry the water, and they had to come up to speed on these pieces of legislation. So you look at the special purpose depository institution legislation that we ran last year as a great example of that. It had to go through the Minerals Committee, which is Minerals Business and Economic Development. It has oversight of banking, and the banking division works with the Minerals Committee. So it was a lot of work to do it that way. But in the end, we got a 12-1 vote, I think, out of the Minerals Committee. There was one detractor on the Minerals Committee and a bunch of enthusiastic supporters. After they waded through hours of public testimony during an interim committee meeting, that in my opinion was the key to that legislation passing in the form that it passed. If we didn't have that committee meeting in the Minerals Committee, I don't think we have special purpose depository institutions in the state of Wyoming at this point, because they were just confusing. They were challenging. There was so much work that went into it that it took longer to get the Minerals Committee up to speed than the Minerals Committee would have in a standard committee meeting during the legislative session, which would be what would take place if we had the select committee sponsoring the legislation rather than the committee. So I want the committee to think about that. You know, how would things be different if we had sponsored these directly and not had the benefit of working through the interim, bringing up to speed standing committees? And I have some concern about that. As far as the gubernatorial appointees, I think I understand the need to make sure that we get excellent appointees and we get them in a timely manner from the governor, but the same argument about buy-in takes place where we've had strong support from the governor on everything we've done, and I think part of that is because the governor has ownership through his appointees, a feeling of responsibility that he was complicit, we'll say, in the drafting of this legislation, which might not be the case if we make it all legislative. So that's another concern I'd be interested in feedback from the community when we take public testimony on. As far as the name and the specific topic areas, there's an advantage to being the blockchain task force or the blockchain select committee and calling that out explicitly that I don't think you get when you just broaden the name. People are looking for it. People are then expecting this to be the topic. So I'm a little concerned that if we overly broaden the area, even though I'm an advanced technologies guy, that's what my background is, and I like a lot of different advanced technologies. I'm interested in a lot of different areas, but I am concerned that we would lose a little bit of the public focus if we take blockchain out explicitly, and people will have a harder time finding us if they are disconnected for a temporary period of time, Mr. Co-Chairman. So I want to see blockchain somehow continue. I want to expand our mission to allow us to more broadly get into financial technologies, perhaps. And then the question is, do we want to get outside of financial technologies? As written, we could be working on next generation carbon capture and sequestration based on this, which would be great. Again, that's much closer to what I do. But is that too broad, and are we then too nuanced? And so with those couple of points, committee, does anyone have any thoughts on any of those topics before we get to public testimony and hear some more? Yeah, please go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, I think that narrowing the focus into the blockchain, Bitcoin, fintech area is a big advantage. I think the best things that have come out of this task force have been because of that focus. The making it more generic could be challenging, both for attention to the task force and for getting experts outside of the legislature. I mean, if it's super general purpose, then there might not be the right people to fill in here.
Yeah. Good points. Other thoughts, Ms. Long? Okay. Yes, Representative Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to jump back to the governor's appointees, and I'm hoping Ian can answer this question. For select committees that we currently have, how many committees do we have that have governor's appointees?
Mr. Chairman, don't know the answer to that question. I can find out for you. As I think about it, I don't recall any that are currently in statute that have governors appointed. I can confirm that for you.
Mr. Chairman, I might also add that this concept of executive branch liaisons is wholly unique to this bill draft. That's not modeled on any other existing task force or select committee. This was a concept created for this bill draft to match the direction of the committee. So I'm not sure, like Ian says, that we have any other select committees that have executive branch members or liaisons.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And that kind of brings up another point that Tamara had stated, that there should be that difference between branches, that check on branches. And so because a task force has to sell it to another committee, and that's largely on the legislators that are on that committee, because this select committee would be able to sponsor their own legislation. It is definitely worth thinking about in regards to that governor's appointee. Do we want to allow essentially the governor's office to be able to sponsor their own legislation? And that's kind of makes me hesitate on why I lean a little bit harder towards appointments coming from the legislative branch versus the executive.
Thanks. Other thoughts? All right, seeing none, let's see if there's any public testimony on this legislation. Would anyone like to provide their thoughts on this legislation, any of the points we've discussed? If so, please join us up at the podium. All right, well, that was an easy one. I suspect there will be some thoughts on further legislation. All right, seeing no public testimony is closed. Committee, what's your pleasure? All right, I have a motion. Is there a second? Second. Motion and a second. Who was the second? Motion was, all right, Cyrus is the winner on the second, and I believe Representative Olson was the movant.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes,
I have an
Representative
amendment.
Olson.
I would amend let's start with the title. I would amend it to the Select Committee on Blockchain, Digital Technology, and Innovation. And then, well, let's just take them. We'll take them one at a time. So we'll start with the title, because I think what we want to do is conform that throughout, obviously, but we can get more into the substance when we get into things like, what is the committee doing to promote technology innovation, and we conform that. And I'm totally amicable to, I should just say, to playing with those words. I totally agree, Mr. Chairman, with the concept of keeping blockchain present in the committees, but I also believe in broadening it. And personally, I would like to work on things like AI on this committee, for example, and I think this committee would be fit for that. So I don't want to narrow it too much.
So the motion is to change the title to Select Committee on Blockchain, Digital Technology and Innovation. Blockchain, Digital Technology and Innovation. Select Committee on Blockchain, Digital Technology and Innovation. Is there a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Discussion on that title.
Mr.
Ms.
Chairman?
Long.
I do think it's important to get the financial nexus in somehow. So I'm wondering if there's a friendly amendment that I may be able to propose to that previous motion, which would be Select Committee on Blockchain, FinTech, and Digital Innovation. Do you like that?
Representative, thoughts?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think that's not bad, actually. I was trying to narrow technology, not because I don't want to deal with carbon sequestration, but I just think there are other committees that may want to deal with it. So I think that I think that's good.
Question.
The second's good with it also. If somebody can come up with an acronym that spells Tyler, that'd be cool too.
I know. So that was obviously what I was trying to do.
Question.
Question on that.
Let me repeat the motion. Select Committee on Blockchain, FinTech, and Digital Information.
Innovation.
Digital Innovation. Yes.
Unusual to use an informal term like fintech. Would it be okay? Would you consider using financial technology instead? It's fine either way. I mean,
It is.
We can
It is a
certainly
bit
name
slangy.
It's just we'll go
Yeah.
in statute that way, and usually we use a more formal name.
So, blockchain, financial technology, and digital innovation.
I'm looking at Caitlin right now.
Mr. Chairman, yes, that's fine.
All right.
Okay.
It's a long title,
Yeah,
but it's not the longest
All right.
we've had, and won't
Title's
be the
getting
longest
long.
we have now. Any further discussion?
Can you throw in economic development and remove that from minerals committee?
All right, the question's been vigorously called. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion is carried. All right. Any other amendments then to conform this legislation accordingly? I'm looking at you, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes. So we could go, I mean, it's a pretty small bill, but I think we don't need to go line by line. I think
No,
if we
just
just have it a conforming amendment, so anywhere that it reads Select Committee on Technology and then Select Committee on Innovation, Select Committee on Technology and Innovation, we would conform to that. I think even particularly, I'm just looking at page 3, line 6
Right.
through 7, where we actually begin to spell out, 3 through 7, where we spell out what we're doing. I think even just conforming the title there where it says technology innovation will actually be okay. If it were to read, Mr. Chairman, just so the record is clear, on page 3, line 4, members regarding issues pertaining to blockchain, financial technology, and digital innovation.
All right, so conform throughout. Mr. Co-Chairman?
Yeah, I think along that point, we should probably, knowing the history of the state senate this last session, just go ahead and amend somewhere in there Medicaid expansion to study it.
Yeah,
because that seems to be the
great. Okay, just tack.
Senate.
All right, that sounded unfriendly. Although good for me. So make that in the form of a motion, I assume, Representative Olson? And Mr. Co-Chairman, was that a second I was hearing from you? All right, we've got a motion and a second basically to go through and conform that language. Is that clear, Ian and Tamara, I assume? All right. Any further discussion on that point? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? Motion carries.
Mr.
Yes,
I have another.
Co-Chairman, hit it.
I have another amendment, Mr. Chairman.
or excuse me, Mr. Representative Olson.
If unless we're still on that
Nope, we're
beautiful
done.
naming amendment.
We passed.
Pretty happy with that. All right, Mr. Chairman, on page 4, line 19, I would amend striking the governor and replacing the governor with the president of the Senate and the Speaker of the House to continue shall appoint liaisons, etc. And conforming throughout.
All right, we've got a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. Any discussion on shifting it from the governor appointments, gubernatorial appointments, to legislative only appointments? Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this goes back to the issues that I brought up earlier. It's nothing against the governor's office. I think they do a great job with the amount of workload that they have, but it is a huge workload. And then coupled with the fact that it is a select committee that can sponsor their own legislation, and I do think it would be kind of inappropriate if we had the executive branch able to sponsor their own legislation.
Okay. Additional discussion? I will just point out that whether it's the governor or not, they don't have a vote on the sponsorship. So they'd just be a liaison and a non-voting member.
Mr. Chairman, that's
Senator.
what I was pointing out. And I actually like having the non-members there as long as they're non-voting, which is what we've done. You look at where we've gone, where we're at, and I'm looking at both sides of me. We wouldn't be where we're at without the non-members. So to me, it makes sense to have the non-voting members.
Oh, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
I think, so Senator Driscoll, the amendment does not remove those members. The amendment just says that they're appointed from the President of the Senate, so our non-voting members stay the same. It's just they're not appointed by the governor's office. They're appointed by the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House.
Mr. Co-Chairman, I'm speaking against that. I still think the governor should appoint them.
Further discussion? And Mr. Co-Chairman, before we vote, I'll say that I'm going to be a no on this also. I think it's important that the governor have buy-in. As long as they don't vote, I see no problem with separation, because you have to have majority of only legislative members to carry a motion that's going to sponsor legislation. So with that, I'll be a no. Yep. Senator?
Senate stands together on that.
All right, look at that.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Co-Chairman.
I would like to call on Representative Western.
You want to hear from Representative Western, the alternate? Yes, Representative.
He's voting now.
Is he a voting alternate?
Yeah.
You're throwing him under the bus just like I did Representative Olson a minute ago. Go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I kind of feel like we're splitting hairs here a little bit, but that's just my personal opinion. I'm fine with a member of the executive branch being on there again, as long as we maintain separation. That's my priority. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. Any further thoughts before we take a vote on this? All right. Any thoughts? I would like to hear from our appointees. Although maybe I'm putting you on the spot because you're gubernatorial appointees, so maybe I shouldn't do that, since then you'll be throwing the governor under the bus potentially. So I'll just punt on asking you whether you think so or not, so you're not on the spot. All right. Any further points? Representative Western, you want to weigh in again despite your lukewarm previous analysis?
Question, Mr. Chairman.
All right. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? No. Chair's in doubt. All those in favor, please raise your hand.
Lone Ranger and his buddy.
Opposed? Raise your hand. Oh. All right, motion fails. Back on the bill. Further amendments? You'll get it on the House. I know you will. I know you will. I know you will. That's what the Senate's for. What are you?
We won't be
What
meeting after
else?
midnight again, Tyler.
Yes, we will. Anything else? Further amendments?
Question on the bill.
Seeing none, question's been called on the bill. Roll call on the bill, please, Ian.
Senator Nethercott.
Aye.
Senator Driscoll.
Aye.
Representative Olson. Representative Yin excused. Representative Western. Mr. Cole. Ms. Long. Mr. Kaufman. Co-Chairman Lindholm.
Aye.
And Co-Chairman Rothfeld.
Aye.
Motion passes.
All right. Well, we got our first little piece of legislation for the session. Good job, everyone.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if it's appropriate, usually but I would like to, because that is a final roll call, I would like to hear from the committee on, my opinion is that one will go to corporations. I heard that's a good committee. The chairman is friendly on there, so yeah, he's a friendly chairman. But I would like to hear from the rest of the committee if they think it should go somewhere else, maybe like travel rec.
Otherwise, travel rec.
Make no guarantees.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, go ahead.
Vice President of the Senate, your good Senator Nethercott is on the Corporations Committee. I will make sure that amendment is unsuccessful.
There we go. All right. We could always give it to Judiciary Committee too. I know the chairwoman. All right. Yep. Sounds like we'll send that to corporations next for sponsorship. So if we can get that, and let's leave that subject. We won't make a motion on it. Let's leave it subject to further negotiation because I don't want to overwhelm the Corporations Committee, and I know that we've got several other bills that we're probably going to send to them. So maybe TRW is the place for that one. We'll check it out.
We could easily
We have,
handle it.
I think
They
we have
tried
4
to
for
kill
you.
the bill, though.
Yeah, they probably killed the bill. That's true. Good point. Never mind. All right. Anything further on that before we move to the next agenda item, committee? Seeing none. Next piece of legislation for our consideration is municipal bonds, digital securities. Again, committee, that should be next in the packet. And with that, Tamara or Ian?
This bill draft came from a motion made at your last meeting, and it was a pretty simple motion. It was to draft legislation to amend local government bonding statutes, allow the issuer of bonds to issue the bonds as digital securities, as you had defined in one of the bills last year that was passed 3429-101A. What is a digital security? So that's what you have in front of you. It's a fairly simple bill to go into the general bonding statute and make a blanket amendment because we have many statutes that govern who can bond and what kind of bonds they may issue. Many different entities can bond. And so it goes into this general statute and amends that to allow for bonds to be issued as digital securities. And so I can walk through the bill now, which is fairly short. On page 1, you have a staff comment that notes that I've included 16.501 just for context purposes to show that this article applies to bonds, notes, warrants, certificates, et cetera, that are issued on behalf of the state or any political subdivision, district, board, agency, commission, etc. The new change will come on 16.502 by creating a new subsection B and to specifically allow political subdivisions. They're not any entity. The motion was specific to local governments, and so the bill is drafted as specific to political subdivisions to allow them to issue bonds if they so choose as digital securities, as long as the bonds are otherwise issued in accordance with all applicable state and federal laws and regulations. And if you'll recall, digital security means a digital asset which constitutes a security excluding digital consumer assets and virtual currency.
Thank you. Any questions for Tamara, committee? Any questions? All right. Seeing none, committee, any questions or discussion on the bill before we go to public testimony? Co-Chairman Lindholm?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could ask Kelly Janes with the Secretary of State's office to come talk about digital securities.
Welcome. Please introduce yourself to the committee.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Kelly Janes, Compliance Director, Wyoming Secretary of State's Office. This bill does not affect our office whatsoever. Municipal bonds and all bonds issued by any government are exempt from our uniform security statutes.
Okay. Mr. Co-Chairman.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have some questions in regards to digital securities. In this past session, we passed legislation in regards to certificated shares having a digital representation. Prior years, we passed uncertificated shares in regards to having digital representation. Could a certificated or uncertificated share be a digital security? And would that fall under the definition of digital security?
Ms. James.
Mr. Chairman, I don't believe that would. It does not affect our office either way, our regulation. So I'm not sure the answer to that question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just as a follow-up, Mr. Chairman, I think so. So a bond is essentially a bond may be issued under as a digital security. So could a certificated share that is a digital representation in regards to past legislation be a digital security?
Mr. Chairman, yes, I believe it would.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any further questions for Ms. James? All right, seeing none, thank you. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Is anyone here from the Wyoming Association of Municipalities or the County Commissioners Association? I don't believe so, but we heard from them. So, Mr. Co-Chairman, can you summarize the response that we heard from them?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Surprisingly, usually when I'm involved in legislation, WHAM comes out against as a, I think it's like their standard playbook.
It's easy for them.
Understandably,
Right.
They have every right to. So WHAM got a hold of myself and co-chairman, and so did the County Commissioners Association, and they didn't see any issues with the legislation. Just provides more tools in the toolbox for them, and considering how technology is moving forward, and especially in regards to the state of Wyoming and what we've done in regards to digital securities, they thought it is appropriate. They don't know that they'll have anybody utilize it, but that eventuality may happen someday.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Yeah. Recall from our previous discussion, this doesn't do anything substantive in terms of changing the authority of what our municipalities and cities, towns, and counties can do, political subdivisions, but makes it clear that the issuance of bonds can take place as digital securities where there wasn't clarity before. So it's more of the tool or the vehicle for issuing rather than the authority to issue bonds, which is exactly as it was before. Any discussion, committee, before we go to general public comments? Seeing none. Would anyone like to comment on this legislation at this time? Please come up and introduce yourself. Once again, hello.
Chairman, my name is Emma Channing. I represent Consensus, including Consensus Digital Securities. My name is Mayan. We would just want to, notwithstanding it's clarifying legislation, we find it actually very useful and important clarifying legislation. We suspect a great deal of the emergence in terms of digital securities will be munis, and we are working with a number of legislative bodies across the US, and we would always like to be able to point to something like this, just to give that clarity when we're trying to get opinions. As you know, with the process of a municipal bond, you have to have an opinion from a law firm, and this just will smooth away.
Questions for Ms. Channing before she leaves us? Seeing none, thank you. Any further public comment on this legislation at this time? Seeing none, public comments closed. Back to the committee. What's your pleasure?
Bill?
I've heard a motion from Representative Lindholm and a second from Ms. Long. All right, with that, Ms. Long.
Mr. Chairman, we had multiple requests when I sought input from the industry. There were at least two that I can recall who came forward and asked for this legislation to be able to foster a digital muni bond market. And so we will be the first yet again.
Hooray.
If this bill becomes law.
Yeah, I think it's a neat opportunity. Yeah. Mr. Kaufman.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to add, I'm not a bond expert, but one of my law partners is a bond expert, and we circulated this draft bill to a group of bond attorneys and bankers, and it was green lights from everybody.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for doing that. Appreciate it. Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I have hesitation on my motion now. Usually our bills are somewhat contentious and somebody hates me for it, so.
Do you want to add? Do you want to amend it?
Yeah. Everybody but no.
All right. Further discussion before we take action on the bill?
Question, Bill.
Question's been called. Shall we go straight to roll call? We good with that? All right. Roll call.
Senator Nethercott.
Aye.
Senator Driscoll.
Aye.
Representative Olson. Representative Ian is excused. Representative Western. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Ms. Long.
Aye.
Mr. Kaufman. Co-Chairman Lindholm.
Aye.
Chairman Rothfuss.
Aye.
Motion passes. Thank you.
Does municipal bonds, do they typically go through corporations or would they typically go through minerals committee? Those are the two that I can see. Mr. Co-Chairman.
I think, Mr. Chairman, so corporations handles most of WAM's issues, but I do think this would be more appropriate going to minerals, considering their banking relationship, and the division of banking will probably be questioned
he says
during
no.
minerals on that.
He
No,
doesn't know anything about it.
send it to Travel Rec, I guess.
It's always very difficult to read, Director Commissioner
Judiciary?
Faulkner's
Actually, that
face
makes
there,
sense.
isn't it? Yeah.
We can always send it to Judiciary too. Rumor has it that chairman's friendly towards this legislation also.
I think she is. Staff, what are your thoughts? Do you have any idea on which one of the committees this would typically go to?
That would go probably likely to corporations.
Corporations.
Corporations and political
Yeah.
subdivisions. It's a municipal issue.
Okay. I think so. All right, let's tentatively send it to corporations. Is that okay? We'll try and find something for minerals to do at some point. Any further discussion on municipal bonds, digital securities before we move to the next legislation? Seeing none. Up next, I believe, are insurance investments, digital assets. Again, a short piece of legislation, a little bit of a request. Let's walk through that. Tamara or Ian?
And in front of you should be 20 LSO 0078. It's working draft 0.3. And this was another fairly simple motion that was made at the last meeting to bring you back legislation that specifically allows insurance to invest in digital assets. And so that's what you have in front of you. This bill draft goes into the insurance code, Title 26, into Chapter 7, which addresses what an insurer may invest in. And there's a laundry list of things that may be invested in, such as bonds, other indebtedness, stock, securities, etc. It goes into that laundry list and creates a new paragraph on page 2 that would allow for investment in digital assets by an insurer. And again, that's as defined by Wyoming Statute 3429-101A1. That was the same definition for the last bill we just considered, and would require these investments to otherwise comply with all other requirements of the chapter. And those other requirements that are referenced are provided in the staff comment for you. And specifically for an insurer to invest in an asset, there's some requirements. And as you see in A, it must be interest bearing or interest accruing or dividend or income paying. And some other requirements such that it be eligible for purchase at price not above its market value. And I think that's the bill draft.
Thank you, Tamara. Committee, any questions for LSO? Yes, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tamara, do you feel that the way we've got this amendment with those qualifying statutes that are prior that you just read off, do you think in any way that that would limit the ability for this for insurers to be able to purchase, or do you kind of fits?
Tamara.
Mr. Chairman, I think this might be somewhat more appropriate for industry to comment, but I did question whether all digital assets would be interest bearing, interest accruing, or income paying. They're just not traditional investments that you get a dividend on, and maybe some of them would qualify, but maybe not. So I want to take testimony from industry on whether this limits those investments.
Okay, thank you. Representative Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And along those same lines, I'm wondering, previously we carved out a definition for digital consumer asset and separated it from our definition of digital asset. And I'm wondering if by simply applying this statute only to the definition of digital asset as defined in 3429-101 AI, which A2 2, I believe, is where we define digital consumer asset. I'm just wondering if that is also a limitation, and I'm not sure. I'm just not sure. I'm not sure. Maybe that's a comment from industry, but it could be a comment from LSO as well.
Tamara?
The digital asset is the broadest term we have within the digital asset chapter, and it includes digital consumer assets, digital securities, and virtual currency.
Thank you, Tamara. Further discussion? Ms. Long.
Thank you. Having run a couple of insurance companies in my past life, a couple of things are of note here. In line 16 on page 2, there is in the Wyoming statute existing a sentence that says any stock which has the ability to appreciate in value should be considered to be income paying for purposes of this subsection. I would propose that we amend that to, when we get to that point, I will propose an amendment. Where I'm going is these are not going to be considered NAIC 1, 2, or 3 assets. So the insurance companies are not going to be heavily investing in these because these would have significant capital charges. This is more of an enabling statute to allow insurance companies to invest in them, and that would enable them to put them in variable annuities and things like that. So from an investment perspective, the fact that we already allow in Wyoming statutes non-income and non-dividend producing assets to be invested by an insurance company, I think covers us in the fact that some of these assets will not be dividend or income paying. They will be about capital appreciation. I also separately had a concern that I think we should discuss, which is digital consumer assets. We made a significant attempt following on Representative Olson's comment to carve those out and treat them differently in a lot of different, in our laws, in our UCC, in our securities amendments, expressly making it clear that they were not securities. And so I'm almost wondering if we shouldn't carve those out and not include those. So instead of saying digital assets, that maybe we say digital securities and virtual currencies. Virtual currencies are considered commodities under under CFTC regulations. They're not considered securities, and insurance companies can invest in commodities all the time. So that's why I was sort of thinking both digital securities and virtual currencies, and leaving out digital consumer tokens. But I'm also interested in hearing public comment and open to being persuaded. I just wanted to lay out that I think those 2 of our 3 categories do make sense. The digital consumer tokens maybe is a different category.
Yeah, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. So with that, Ms. Long, what would be your suggestion very specifically in light of your rationale, which I think is correct?
Go ahead, Ms. Long.
Mr. Chairman, when we get to working the bill, what I would think, Senator Nethercott, is an amendment that instead of saying digital assets, it would say digital securities and virtual currencies. And it would be both in line 1 on page 2 and in line 16 where we say any stock, and then I would add digital security and virtual currency.
Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. So I think this is just a staff comment, so we would need to definitely amend that in a new version of the draft bill to recognize that 267107 would be amended accordingly. So, okay, thank you.
Senator Nethercott. The question I have for staff and the committee is the way this is structured. My understanding is it doesn't really create, and maybe it does, but similar to last time, we were trying to get it so that investments that they have right now, restrictions that they have right now, would still apply. You'd have roughly the same types of classes, or I shouldn't say roughly, I should say exactly the same types of classes available because of what we have in 267104, the restrictions, but that a digital asset that otherwise meets it would be qualified. So I guess I'll ask staff, are we creating new classes by saying digital assets broadly, as opposed to, as Ms. Long says, digital securities and virtual currencies? Or does this already accomplish what Ms. Long is saying because the restrictions apply regardless? That might be overly complex question. I don't know if we know. Tamara, what are your thoughts? If that made sense.
Mr. Chairman, I think that the insurance code is old and it doesn't necessarily work well and envision what a digital asset would be. So to say that digital assets, that you can fit in the existing laundry list and say if any of those things are issued as digital assets, I think that that could be done, and I think that is accomplished with the bill by creating a new paragraph and saying that it otherwise complies with all other requirements of this chapter. But what it's not saying is that digital assets that are that are included in the laundry list when put in digital form are permissive. What it's saying is a new class of assets, digital assets, are permissive,
Okay.
as long as they comply with the general requirements which are in that staff comment.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Long.
Along those lines, if you recall, when we passed the bill in 2018, the utility token bill,
Yeah.
it specifically prohibited the originator from marketing it as a financial investment. Now that goes to the distribution of the asset at its initial offering, but that's why carving it out of here probably does make sense. It just makes it stronger that we're not trying to sort of slip it back in as if it's a security. I realize that these are two different parts of Wyoming statutes, but it helps us
Right.
keep consistent.
So, Ms. Long, line 16 on page 2, any stock or digital security, that's your thought for that line?
Or virtual currency as well, Mr.
Well,
Chairman.
that was my
Yeah.
question. So do we want virtual currency there? Because it really isn't necessarily consistent on that line with the original intent, but that's what I'm getting at. Would we? I see concern potentially with having, well, I'll ask this. If a virtual currency is considered a similar instrument to currencies,
Mm-hmm.
are we adding a new concept that didn't previously exist? So now you can use a virtual currency here where you couldn't trade a currency or utilize a currency under paragraph A. I don't know that paragraph A was contemplating currencies as an investment. And I literally, I don't know that it, that it wasn't. I don't know that it wasn't. Any thoughts, Tamara or Ian, on that at this time?
Mr. Chairman, we
Go ahead,
may
Ms.
need
Long.
to ask LSO
Yeah.
to conform. There may be other places. Your point is
And
well
maybe
taken.
we have someone here who knows, but I don't think we have insurance here, do we?
No, Mr. Chairman,
You
the
wanna-
insurance division did probably call you also. They left me a message stating they didn't
Yeah.
have any issues with the bill as it was drafted, but we're going to be amending it, so
Right.
we'll see.
Exactly. Clearly, they should have been here. All right. Strong points. Any further discussion? Committee, any other thoughts before we go to public testimony? See what the public thinks. All right. We'll open it up for public testimony. If anyone knows any of the answers to these questions or more, we would invite you up front, or if you have any other viewpoints, please join us. And once again, please introduce yourself and welcome to the Blockchain Task Force.
Bob Cornish, Anderson Kill, member of the Wyoming Bar. Clearly in favor of this bill. I think there's a burgeoning captive insurance market that you're going to be capturing with this. The clarity in the bill is very important to write up. One of the challenges that any of us practicing in the digital assets arena face are dealing with clients who are not necessarily experienced in the draftsman skills and care that we are all putting into all these every last word in these statutes. But Matt, you probably know as well as I do, when you talk to somebody who's involved in this area, the first thing they say, I don't understand what this law is telling me. And one of the jobs of this task force, I think, in being innovators, is providing the clearest legislation and to market participants. With that in mind, I think Caitlin is absolutely right in terms of the commodity classification of digital currency. I think there's probably an amendment you can come up with that addresses some savings that says to the extent that digital assets are deemed commodities or something to that effect, they are permissible. Clearly, you cannot contravene NAIC rules But I think what you just want to have as, you know, for whatever amendments you want to draft, they just need to be as clear as possible so that people know what they can.
Excellent, thank you. Do you have a sense of, since you've worked in this area before, we'll see if you have any idea, this paragraph A, which nobody knows what it means, does it contemplate currency transactions or not?
No security or investment. An investment can, you know, you start jumping into the Howey test, right?
Right.
Now, if I buy $1 with the idea that it's going to appreciate, is that an investment? Arguably, you know, you start getting into all these fun hair-splitting arguments that lawyers tend to love to talk about. But I think an investment be covered as long as you are complying with the rest of the law.
Okay, thank you. Any further public comment? Further public comment? Seeing none, public comments closed. Committee, what's your pleasure?
Bill.
Got a motion, is there a second? Got a motion and a second. So Chairman Lindholm and Ms. Long.
Been scrolling through, if I may,
Please.
and trying to find out if other commodities and other currencies are permissive investments. And so we're creating paragraph 16 here. Of the 15 paragraphs above that, I do not see anything that specifically allows insurance investment in any other currency or commodity.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Long?
It is a good question because insurance companies do invest in gold and timber and yeah, so it may be that that's just an oversight in the Wyoming statute. I don't know.
Okay, Mr. Co-Chairman?
Yeah, thanks. So in regards to NAIC accreditation, Wyoming is up to date, unfortunately. There's nothing worse in this world than accreditation, in my opinion. And you really don't have much of a choice. So you either have the federal government control this, or you have an accreditation type organization that says you got to do this. So we end up putting a lot of our statutes towards the whims of New York because we don't want the Fed dictating this. So it's a tough deal. In regards to this aspect, if it's silent on it, I got to imagine that's why insurance companies are doing it.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Yes, go ahead. Another comment.
So having served on the Corporations Committee for a number of years now and being very familiar with the NAICS concerns, and the committee in the Wyoming legislature is committed to making sure that Wyoming remains compliant with the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. It's been made very clear by the State of Wyoming Department of Insurance that being in compliance is certainly in the state's best interest. So I do believe that this is an issue that we need to inquire about and just leave the question there as to why our statute is silent as to the ability of insurance companies to invest in things like gold and timber, as I believe Ms. Long is correct in that as well. So perhaps we're just not fully vetting through those insurance codes, which is long and arduous. But I think it probably will be there and there would be some insight. I don't think anybody from the Department of Insurance is here today, but I think this is a question we can solve without the need for rhetoric. But nonetheless.
Thank you, Senator Nathan. And yeah, the insurance commissioner did provide feedback that legislation as drafted was fine, so I assume that means that it was NAIC compliant. But if we're looking to make that clarification, I'm inclined to move this to the next committee meeting, make sure that the insurance commissioner or a representative is present, ask these questions, and make sure we get the language right. So that's my thought, committee. Anyone disagree with that approach? Does anyone want to take action today, or shall we get this answered, email them, ask staff to send out that inquiry and make sure we're doing it right next time? Thoughts? Ms. Long.
Thank you. There's a concept called admitted assets in insurance, and the admitted assets are very prescribed in statute, and then non-admitted assets, which is a catch-all bucket. So I'm not surprised that the that the statutes don't actually prescribe what a non-admitted asset can be. The admitted assets are all the NAIC 1, 2, 3, and I believe NAIC 4, and then there's 5 and 6 are, I believe, non-admitted. I've got some cobwebs because it's been a few years, but the gist is, I wouldn't be surprised if the standard statute doesn't actually prescribe what a non-admitted asset is. And in other words, it wouldn't necessarily list commodities as a permissible investment because we know it's not an admitted asset. And so I think that we're probably fine on this, but I'm okay if you want to push this to the next meeting. Yeah, makes sense.
Okay. Any further thoughts? All right. Any objection to moving this to the next meeting? Seeing none, let's move this to the next meeting agenda. And Ia, Tamron, and Kelly, now without objection, it's just going to do. Please ask these questions, look into it, get the insurance commissioner, and make sure that the insurance commissioner knows we're going to have questions for the next committee meeting regarding this legislation. Thank you. All right, moving on. Next piece of legislation for our consideration is letters of credit blockchain, which once again is queued up in our packet. Who's going to be doing this one, Tamara?
Mr. Chairman, this bill draft is 20 LSO 161. It's working draft version 0.3. And the motion at the last meeting was to allow for letters of credit to be issued in the blockchain media. And that's what this bill draft does. The substance of it begins on page 2. And what we're doing here is amending the Uniform Commercial Code as adopted by Wyoming's Uniform Commercial Code, to specifically revise the definitions for document and record to reference blockchain media. So right now, Wyoming adopted the Uniform Commercial Code, and it was last amended in 1997. Or it was adopted in 1997, and it's only been amended once, and that was to conform to references that were adopted in uniform revisions. So what I'm trying to say is we have the Uniform Commercial Code that exists in all states that have adopted it verbatim without changes. And this would be a change to that uniform code that would make Wyoming's different from other states. Not if that's good or bad, but just pointing that out. So by amending the definition of document, we'd go in on lines 22 and 23 on page 2 to specify that document means any item which is presented in written or other medium, including the medium of blockchain, as defined in 3429-106-GI, permitted by the letter of credit, unless prohibited by the letter of credit or by standard practice. And the official comment that's included in the staff comment provides a little bit of context for how currently the Uniform Commercial Code is interpreted to apply to digital media generally. They're a little outdated. They use the example of a fax. Whether or not a document that's sent in a fax form could be included. And what they say is that yes, digital media is included and can be permissive as long as it's permitted by the letter of credit itself, the terms of the letter of credit, or it's common practice in the industry to allow documents to be referenced that are in some kind of digital media. So amending it to include blockchain would just specifically point that out and make it explicitly permissive. And similarly, I think on page 4, we have the definition of record. And a record is the form by which the letter of credit may be issued. So by saying that a letter of credit may be issued in a record that includes the medium of blockchain, that's allowing the letter of credit itself to be represented in blockchain media. And currently, record must be capable of being converted to a perceivable form, and that does not change. It would be a retrievable or perceivable form. There'd still have to be some sort of ability to print off or send an electronic copy or somehow document and perceive this letter of credit that's being issued in the blockchain media. So I hope that all makes sense, but if you have any questions, I'll stand.
Thank you, Tamara.
Mr. Chairman.
Back to the committee, Representative Olson.
Yeah, I'm just, maybe some background I'm trying to remember from the previous meeting what conversation spawned this bill, and the reason why I'm asking that is for two reasons. One, I'm wondering, do we have a use case issue that spawned this that I'm not thinking of? And then number two, I'm just wondering, even if we have that, I want to know if there's a use case, because I think the context would matter. Because as I read the existing statute, presented in written or other medium, record means, et cetera, stored in an electronic or other medium. I can't see how blockchain's not encapsulated in other medium. So I don't know why this came about.
All right. Thank you, Representative. Ms. Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Olson, we did have requests for clarification that blockchain issued letters of credit be authorized. What I didn't understand at the time is exactly the point you made, which is that they do appear to be authorized from the language. And so my question to the practicing attorneys on this panel is the language clear enough that legal opinions could be granted that this is legal? If so, maybe this bill is superfluous and not necessary.
Thank you, Ms. Long.
Mr. Co-Chairman?
Yes. Senator Nethercott.
So this same concept of statutory construction that you're referring to, including in this bill and the next bill we're going to discuss, touch on the same thing. So I just want to put everyone's minds there. I do think it is superfluous, and I think it creates maybe a potential danger by including the term blockchain, that any other mediums associated with computer technology would be excluded by including blockchain, and we don't want to do that. So we're actually doing more harm than good with this effort, both in this bill and the next, and I would not vote to advance these bills.
Thank you, Senator.
Do you see how pithy that was and concise? Motion to kill.
Well, we won't take a motion to kill, unfortunately, until we have public comment to find out whether whether there is interest here. We have had pieces of legislation in the past, recall, where we thought it was clear in the statute that something would be allowed, but in practice it wasn't happening and it was being precluded based on interpretation. So I do want to make sure that the public is comfortable that this could already be done. I think there is an interest in ensuring, and again, blockchain is perhaps overly explicit, but the idea of ensuring that it's included, I think, is the intent here. And Co-Chairman Lindholm just wants to amend the uniform laws anyway. So anything further, committee, before we go to public testimony? All right. Open it to public testimony. Is there any interest or necessity for us to have this explicit inclusion in statute? Would anyone like to provide testimony? Yep, please join us. Introduce yourself once again in case people are just tuning in.
Bob Cornish, attorney. I will take my lumps on this. But I do think the explicit term blockchain is important for a number of reasons. One, any attorney that's rendering an opinion regarding the ability of somebody to do something under the Wyoming laws would appreciate the clarity, even though there is the language other medium. The idea that I could go to a law firm and draft I would have to draft I would not be able to offer them an unqualified opinion based on their ability to do certain things because of the lack of clarity in the statute. I would have to say that while the statute is silent, the statute does say other, and other may well encompass this, but given other things, there cannot be total legislative clarity. If that language is in there, it's a lot easier for an attorney to render an opinion, and that's the kind of. I mean, I know it sounds pithy, but for an attorney that has to write a qualified or an unqualified opinion for a bank or another financial institution, that word blockchain is golden, frankly.
Yes, go ahead, Senator Nethercott.
Thank you. May I ask kind of an inquiry there? I don't disagree with you that when you're being asked to write an opinion specifically from a blockchain, that having express statutory authority that makes it unequivocal that that is most helpful. However, in the circumstance where it would be other medium that you might be having to write an opinion from, do you think that the inclusion of the term blockchain actually makes you more at risk in providing a qualified opinion because that particular medium is not expressly listed in the statute? And we, the legislature, drafting these bills and making sure the law is current, are in this unending cycle of updating the laws and putting this long list of every potential source of medium to make every bond writing attorney feel quite comfortable in issuing that opinion because it's expressly listed in statute. So when we're looking at that, that's my concern.
I acknowledge that. I acknowledge that concern, but I think Wyoming, the state of legislation in Wyoming is a little different with respect to UCC matters, given the fact that we have specific blockchain UCC provisions that we've already put in place. I think having the letter of credit language in there saying that this is not, that this is somehow working in tandem with the other pieces that we've already been talking about shows not only that it's, I don't think it's standing alone and carving blockchain out. I think it's more conforming with the amendments that we've already made to the UCC.
Thank you, Mr. Cornish. Senator Nethercott. Follow up?
No, thank you.
Pithy as always. Anyone else?
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Kaufman. No, please stay.
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. Further questions for Mr. Cornish, who is walking away, but we do have the opportunity to call him back. Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Cornish. All right, Mr. Kaufman.
Mr. Chairman, I was just going to say, I was really on the fence with this legislation. I just don't feel strongly one way or the other, but Mr. Cornish may have just convinced me to vote for this because he is right. I'm generally, I hate it just makes me queasy as a lawyer when we start amending uniform acts because it just makes things really complicated from a legal analysis standpoint. But Mr. Cornish is right. We have already made some modifying amendments to the UCC, so to make this probably does make a lot of sense. So I may have just gone from on the fence to I think I'm going to vote in favor.
We do have the alternative, I think, it's something to talk about, of instead of doing the bill this way, including language in the non-codified section of law that clarifies Wyoming's interpretation of the UCC in this particular section, to include the work that we did regarding blockchain, just to clarify it, but not to actually change the uniform code. I think that may be a reasonable compromise. I don't know. I'd actually look to folks that are used to practicing in this space to know whether or not I'm an engineer. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That is exactly right. When I heard the references to us changing the UCC, I was cringing because I don't believe we actually changed the UCC. I think we added an addendum. The SF-125 bill was actually an addendum that didn't actually change the standard language. It was essentially an interpretive addendum, and I would also concur if we do this, maybe that's the right geography in the statutes to do it again.
Okay, Senator Nethercott, you're hating on this legislation. What are your thoughts of that?
Mr. Co-Chairman, I'm not hating on it. I just think that in the excitement of this conversation, we're potentially not seeing what we're not talking about, which is, so I present the question to further the conversation. What other mediums would be applicable here that are not listed that would be prudent to list while we're doing it now? And then let's see where this conversation goes and just how big the rabbit hole might become. So with that, can I hear some feedback either from the public or other committee members about what other sources of medium would be applicable?
Senator, thank you. Anyone want to weigh in on that? And we are still open for public comment at this point, so if anyone wants to join us and discuss, please do. Does anyone deal frequently with these letters of credit in the public? Caitlin, go ahead.
I have a question. I don't know how the official comment works. But if you look at lines 19 and 20, it's talking about a facsimile or a Swift message. Obviously, facsimiles are pretty outdated technology. Swift message soon to be at some point relatively soon. So those are other media. And so maybe the place to do this is to put it in an official comment instead of in the statute. I don't know. But I don't know what that official comment means. Is that something that has any import in the statutes?
I don't know if we have the ability to do the official comment. What is the nature of this official comment?
The official comment, Mr. Chairman, is the Uniform Commercial Code's official comment that's
what I thought.
promulgated by the Uniform Law Commission and written. And Wyoming has adopted those. So when you open our green books, you will see the official comment to Section 5-102A. And in our statutes, it's 34.1-5-102A, but in the UCC, it's 5-102A. And so any state that's adopted the UCC may have also adopted the official comments, and in Wyoming, we did that. And we specifically did that in a codified section the last time the Uniform Commercial Code was generally updated. We told our publisher, LexisNexis, to update the official comments as to match the official comments that had been updated by the Uniform Law Commission. And so we did that. So I can't say that we have ever said update the official comment to include this, but we do sometimes direct our publisher to publish something unique when we have an odd situation with law that's being amended.
So if we were to put something in the non-codified area statute, which is a clarifying statement, I assume that would trump, and maybe we'd reference back to this 5102 of the UCC. Would that be a workable way to clarify that in Wyoming, since we have this new section of statute related to blockchain, that we want to make it clear that blockchain is included in the definition of document? Is that going to have the appropriate effective force of law that will ensure that Mr. Cornish's concerns are met?
Mr. Chairman, I don't believe I can answer whether it's going to have a force or an effective law. I think it would be interpretive guidance, but I don't think we have any other examples where we've said update the official comment, make it a non-official comment, to clarify the meaning of this act or the statute. It's almost a legislative intent that we're trying to put out there and publish in our books. So whether it be in the comment section, which would be unique to tell Lexis to go ahead and amend this text that I provided on page 3 to reference blockchain media. I can't say that it would have any force and effect, but it might be interpretive. The other option would be for you to specify legislative intent in non-codified law.
Right. So I'm sorry, I was a little confusing on my question. I didn't mean changing. I think it would be probably a nightmare to change the official interpretation and start going into that. I meant instead of including a change in statute in the codified section where we're actually changing the UCC, if we put in non-codified that for the purposes of section or Romanet 6 here, document, that shall include blockchain as defined pursuant to the language that we put in about blockchain and the UCC, something along those lines. That I assume that would provide the clarity that we would need, that Mr. Cornish needs, without actually going into and messing with the UCC. Is that accurate?
Yep, Mr. Chairman, I think that could accomplish your intent.
Okay.
I do know non-codified law is easy to forget about in future years, but this might be an important enough area that the attorneys that need to remember it would remember that session law.
Right. Okay. Back to Senator Nethercott's question, though. Does anyone have any follow-up answers or thoughts on an inclusive list of one being a concern of what it excludes?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, go ahead.
I do. I share that same concern. I also think we have in the past, this committee has dealt with the question of whether we become so technology specific versus, of course, we're promoting blockchain, but if we become so technology specific, we limit ourselves. The other thing, that's what I can think about as well. We come back 5 years, 10 years, amend this statute. One of the general rules I think we should always follow in legislating is not to list for this exact reason. Using terms like other medium to be encompassing, that's the idea. also, Mr. Chairman, and just to talk about that non-codified concept, the reality is one of the canons that could be looked at when trying to interpret the statute is legislative intent. And frankly, the journal from this committee could be pulled to help understand that, even if we do nothing. So I'm just saying, if you're reaching that far down to legislative intent, I think we don't have to go so far as to put something in statute for that argument to be made. I just think we're spending a lot of time on this when I think the statute's broader as written, and we limit ourselves if we amend it as such.
Further discussion, Senator Nethercott.
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chairman, thank you. So I think with this area of law, with this type of practice, no one is going into legislative intent for any kind of comfort when providing a legal opinion. It will be the written statutory construction as expressly stated in codified law. That said, when we study this language and understand its source of the Uniform Commercial Code and know that it has been in place for decades and has been unaltered, I think we have to respect that history and just how well the term other medium, as broad and ambiguous as that is really its intention. And so we are upending that by attempting to include this and disregarding the wisdom of the drafters of the UCC and its application over the course of decades, not only here, but really across the country and otherwise. So I do think we're walking into probably unintended consequences territory, and don't think that we should do it. So I stand by my original conclusion, but I do hear the advantages of it, but I don't think it's compelling.
Senator, do you think there's a way to write the language, though, if we did it non-codified, where we made it very clear that we were not trying to create a limited list?
I don't think that would hurt in any way, shape, or form. I don't know that it is that provides much utility to this area of practice, but I think it wouldn't be harmful in any way.
Well, if we have attorneys that are concerned and don't know whether or not they're allowed to accept this, then we're basically in the we don't know right now, and we've got as our guiding principle a fax machine. So I will bag just slightly on the UCC in that maybe they didn't quite keep up with, say, email existing. I mean, they missed the entire email era. Nobody even practically uses it anymore. They skipped over it. I don't know what's coming next.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Yes.
The Constitution of the United States is a pretty good document still today. Nonetheless, when we study that official comment,
it is pretty good.
And we look at lines 23 through 24, there's this concept there that seems superfluous as well, which is you're presenting the document so long as it's permitted by the letter of credit, unless it's prohibited by the letter of credit, of course. And those concepts associated with that of, if the parties agree, essentially, and the letter of credit allows the document to be submitted in whatever form is provided, then that's fine. Unless it doesn't, and then that's not okay. So it's pretty expressed there. So if the transaction allows for the document to be presented via a blockchain or other type of format or other medium, then that's acceptable, right? And that's what the comment indicates as well. And it's kind of this, it's such a simple concept, we're easily overcomplicating it, I believe. So the answer is in the transaction itself, that the letter of credit specifically allows for the submission of it on a blockchain. And that is the solution in the pragmatic world of practicing in this area for the utility of this technology as it applies to these transactions.
So if I want to accept a letter of credit as a blockchain, I can. If I don't have to.
Yes, that is correct.
Committee, other thoughts? We're still open for public testimony. Is there any further public testimony on this legislation? Seeing none, public testimony is closed. Committee, what's your pleasure? Is there a motion? Hearing none. That legislation will will not be moved forward from the committee. It's not dead. We didn't vote it down. So if anybody does come up with a brilliant idea for the next committee meeting, then let us know. But we'll move on to our next piece of legislation related to computer crimes. What's that? Yeah, exactly. If anyone would like to raise that in the future, please fax us a request.
Call ahead of time.
Yeah, call ahead of time.
So
Make sure we have the fax machine on.
They don't want to pick up.
Don't pick up the phone.
Yeah.
That's right. Another of Senator Nethercott's favorite bills is up next. Computer crimes. Tamara or Ian, please. Well, one second. Let's see. What time is it?
Yeah.
I was seeing if we wanted a break before we move to the next one. It is 10:15. That's probably break time, isn't it? All right. Before we get to the next piece of legislation, let's take a hopefully 10-ish minute break and try and make sure that we're going again at around 10:25. Again, before we get into the next piece of legislation, we had a request to do a little bit of public comment related to economic development here in this community. We didn't offer that opportunity when we were on sort of updates of economic development. So I'll open up for that opportunity at this point in time. There we go. Mr. Stender wanted to join us and talk a little bit about things that are going on here for 90 seconds. So we'll offer that opportunity before going into the next legislation. Please introduce yourself to the committee and welcome.
My name is Jay Stender. I work in Sheridan. Chairman Rothfuss, I'd like to, on your initial discussion this morning, you had a topic for economic development. And I want to just pass on some things that we have seen here since the legislative session ended last year. We've had 10 calls relative to blockchain applications, including to mining. Those are sort of anecdotal circumstances. We've also had 4 visits from folks ranging from Southern California to what I call the Valley, Silicon Valley, as well as Austin, people coming to set up essentially blockchain programming circumstances. So if you're looking at economic development and diversity, those are pretty positive circumstances. And then the third thing that I'd like to convey to this committee, within Wyoming, there are pressing social and economic issues associated with harvesting flare gas, which is an off gas that comes from oil and gas development. And again, factually, there is an entity which reached out to us. We don't have a lot of flare gas in Sheridan, but they did set up a facility in Wyoming. They also have facilities in other energy-producing states where they selectively and advantageously harvest flare gas to run gensets to do Bitcoin mining. And so my intention here was to commend the forward thinking relative to this whole concept coming across. Secondly is to provide you with factual information about opportunities for new economic development that occurs at least in Northeast Wyoming. And that's 67 seconds.
Excellent. Thank you so much. But well, before you leave, are there any questions? Shall we clap for all of us? Senator Nethercop wants to clap. All right. Thank you.
This is a good thing. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Mr. Co-Chairman.
You guys have fun.
No, I just wanted to say thanks, and the reason why we're in Sheridan is because of the activity that's been happening up here. Like I said, you can buy bits and spurs in Sheridan, Wyoming now with Bitcoin, and that was because of the efforts of this community. So.
Exactly right.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Really? Here? You can pay at the mill. Is that true? You can pay at the mill by Bitcoin? Anyone verified that?
According to their website.
According to the website. That's excellent. Should have hosted there. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Any further comment on that topic before we go to the next piece of legislation? Seeing none. Up next, computer crimes. Once again, I believe Tamara is going to lead us on this.
Mr. Chairman, members of the task force, this bill is 20 LSO 0057. It's working draft 0.5. And as background on this topic, the task force at the last meeting considered whether the theft statutes and other crime statutes would need to be updated, and they moved to have a bill drafted to specifically include theft of digital assets. They also directed, or authorized, I should say, LSO to work with Mr. Robert Cornish, and so I will say that I did reach out to him and had some good conversations through email about why the existing computer crime statutes might be limited in not covering blockchain type of crimes. This bill draft really addresses 2 issues. The first is to create a new crime of theft of a digital asset, and then to amend the existing computer crime statutes to specifically include blockchain types of crime. So jumping into the bill now, beginning on page 1 and moving on to page 2, you see this new crime being created. The new statute, Wyoming Statute 63415, and it's modeled on our existing theft statute. In fact, it's so closely modeled on the existing theft statute that I believe it's repetitive of it, and that may be an area this task force wants to consider, whether the type of felony and punishment should be exactly the same as existing theft, whether it should be tied to a monetary value, or whether there should be some other distinction. So this new crime would be that a person would be guilty of theft of a digital asset if the person knowingly takes or exercises unauthorized control over or makes an unauthorized transfer of an interest in the digital asset of another person, with the person of depriving the other person of the digital asset. So as you can see in the staff comment, that's very close to existing theft. The change there is, rather than just being specific to the property of another person, it's the digital asset of another person. And like existing theft, theft of a digital asset would be a felony punishable by 10 years of imprisonment and a fine of up to $10,000 if the digital asset was valued at $1,000. It would be a misdemeanor punishable by not more than 6 months and a fine of up to $750, or both if the value of the digital asset was less than $1,000. Moving on to section 2, first we'll amend definitions and then amend all of the computer crime statutes to specifically include blockchain. So on page 3, digital asset, on lines 26 and 27, is added to the definitions and defined as is provided in 3429-101 AI, which we've seen in prior bill drafts. On page 4, we've defined blockchain to mean the same as is defined by 3429-106 GI. And those definitions are provided in the staff comment for you on page 4. 63502 is the first computer crime that's amended, and this is the computer crime of a crime against intellectual property. And this would amend that crime by that a person commits a crime against intellectual property if he knowingly and without authorization modifies data, programs, or supporting documentation residing or existing internal or external to a computer system, computer network, or blockchain. And similarly, or blockchain is added to the other elements of the crime. So it would also be a crime to destroy data, programs, or supporting documentation residing or existing internal or external to a computer system, computer network, or blockchain. And I won't read you all of these crimes, but this is the general concept that's included for all of the computer crimes. The next one is within 63503. This is a crime against computer equipment or supplies. And to the list of things in which a crime may be committed is added blockchain. And so moving on to 63504 is crime against computer users. And similarly, to the list of entities that a crime may be committed against, blockchain is included in that list. So a person commits a crime against a computer user if he knowingly and without authorization accesses a computer system, computer network, or blockchain. Similarly, on page 6, 63506 is computer trespass is amended to include trespass against the blockchain. And that's committing the crime of computer trespass is knowingly and with intent to cause or damage the malfunction of the operation of the computer system, computer network, or blockchain, and without authorization, etc. Similarly, on page 7, 63507, computer extortion is amended to include extortion, computer extortion through damaging a blockchain. That's a person is guilty of computer extortion if he knowingly and without authorization attempts to introduce or directs or induces another to introduce any ransomware into a computer system, computer network, or blockchain. Page 8 is a little different. This is our DCI crime statutes, and it's specifically subsection B, going on to page 9, specifically the Division of Criminal Investigation is directed to investigate suspected violations of computer crimes. And those are the computer crimes that are specified in 63501 through 63507, computer crimes we just addressed, and the new computer crime, theft of a digital asset, which is created by this bill draft 63415. Then finally, Wyoming Statute 40-25-101, which is civil computer trespass. So rather than being a criminal offense, this would be offense, a civil lawsuit could be brought. Similarly, blockchain is amended in to add in that a person may commit, or it's a civil crime to commit civil trespass if the person without intent damages or causes the malfunction of the operation of a computer system, computer network, or blockchain. And a person who has had their blockchain trespassed upon would have a cause of action through page 10. So finally, the staff comment just notes that this is very specific to blockchain media, and if the definitions of computer are deficient to not include blockchain media, the committee might consider whether we need to generally amend those rather than being specific to blockchain, or whether this is what's intended. Finally, I don't know that all of these crimes make perfect sense within the concept of an open blockchain. Perhaps some of them make sense within the concept of a private blockchain, but that might be something the committee wants to consider, whether each of these crimes makes sense to amend. So I will stand for questions now.
Thank you very much. Committee?
Mr. Co-Chairman?
Yes, Senator Nethercott.
I think I've already signaled my appreciation for the bill, but
Still a mystery to me. Go ahead.
indeed. It is very important for this committee and the public to know that the Judiciary Committee is currently rewriting the entire theft statutes entirely, be completely different than what we have had. And so that bill is currently moving forward into the third Judiciary Committee meeting and will likely pass out of that committee. So this work here could be certainly just something to keep in mind as we coordinate both of these efforts. Certainly the Judiciary Committee could adopt these concepts associated with theft of a digital asset. However,
Easy now.
I think all of that is nonsensical and unnecessary. So with that, I end my comments.
Thank you, Senator Nethercott.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Representative Wilson.
Yeah, on a side note, I just wouldn't get too excited about that bill coming out of judiciary, but I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding, Senator.
All right.
Chairman.
Go ahead.
So kind of similar question that I've asked before, some background. I don't know if when we get to public comment, if we have someone from DCI here, but I guess for me, I would want to know if the basis of this entire bill is page 8, where it says the division shall investigate. And then the reality is, I think the question for me would be, is there an issue? Are they not investigating? Because for me, I don't understand how it already doesn't fit inside of their purview. It's already a crime. Whether it's, digital assets or tangible products, we've already defined them as such, and so I'm not sure why they wouldn't have the authority to investigate. So I would really like to hear from DCI, and if we don't have DCI here, and we really are excited about this bill, which I'm not, then I think we should hear from them before we try to monkey with felonies.
Mr. Co-Chairman?
Yes, Senator Nethercott.
Might be able to provide some history regarding the Division of Criminal Investigation, their origins, and the crimes that they shall investigate and the crimes that they may investigate. The creation of DCI was a very politically charged process where many of the local sheriffs and chiefs of police were deeply concerned about consolidating power with one criminal investigative agency and taking away jurisdictional authority from them ultimately. And so the compromise was really to limit their essentially original jurisdiction on their ability to investigate crimes. That said, most of those concerns have been alleviated, I think, through the course of years. However, they are tasked with investigating computer crimes. They are not tasked with investigating other type of assets or theft crimes primarily, but certainly as it relates to computer crimes, they are. How I would see this working in real life is that when somebody living in Rawlins, Wyoming has their digital assets stolen, that they would call the local Rawlins PD, and the Rawlins PD would say, you know what, I think we're better call in some help. And they would contact DCI, and DCI would come assist and investigate. And that's how that has worked historically, as opposed to broadening DCI's jurisdictional authority statewide for these types of crimes. I think it's of note to recognize that nowhere do we talk about other types of investments or stocks or shares or other types of financial holdings that any particular agency is tasked with investigating. If it's your property and it belongs to you and it's stolen, law enforcement will investigate. Depending on its value, will determine whether or not it's a misdemeanor or a felony, and that's quite simply how it's always worked since the beginning of statehood. So.
Thank you, Senator Nethercott. Committee, any other discussion? Yeah, just to clarify, and Senator Nethercutt certainly knows this better than any of us, but that language is the origination concept, Representative. So it's whether they can start an investigation without having it referred to them by a district or county attorney. That's the nuance there to page 8 at the bottom and page 9 at the top. So most of what this legislation does is that aspect is identified, which is to include crimes against the digital assets as theft. Further discussion? Yes, Mr. Paul.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's maybe I'm just reading this wrong, but there's a chance that a lot of these systems, Bitcoin or Ethereum, have their own governance systems that include the ability to reverse transactions or reorg a blockchain that could be construed as theft under this, which would be completely reasonable in the network as it's designed. I don't know if I'm misreading this, but there are completely legitimate uses of blockchain that could be construed as theft under this, I believe.
Thank you. All right, further discussion, committee? Any further discussion before we go to public comment? All right, let's go to public comment at this time. Would anyone like to weigh in on 20 LSO 57, working draft 0.5? Mr. Cornish, welcome back. Even though I just said your name, please introduce yourself to the committee.
Bob Cornish, attorney. There is a reason for this being floated. In my practice, I don't wish Matt were here. People who have had their digital assets purloined or stolen generally face the prospect of not having law enforcement help them, especially in the case where their assets may be held somewhere in the United States and those assets may have been heisted or stolen by people outside of the United States. For those of you who don't know, the FBI has a standing practice not to assist people whose digital assets are stolen in theft matters. They will not investigate them. It's the bottom line. You can call, there's a desk in San Francisco, essentially that's an answering machine. That is essentially your only remedy, unless you can convince local law enforcement to do something about it. And while the resources, I certainly respect the problems that local law enforcement might have in terms of enforcing things or investigating things. But I think the shall language on page 8 that Representative Olson noted was very important with respect to the fact that we're going to have trust companies and banks here in Wyoming, and that in the event that things, hopefully, those banks will be secure and sound, just like any other bank theft or any other, felony of funds from a secure institution. I would just like to be able to counsel somebody to say, yes, there's going to be somebody who's going to look at this for you, and not just take a complaint, swear it out, and put it in a file. I think there just needs to be more appreciation that with the infrastructure that Wyoming wishes to build, sending a message that, you want law-abiding people dealing in this stuff. And for those who don't abide by the law, there is an affirmative obligation by law enforcement to investigate it and not pass the buck saying, well, this is a federal matter. Because that's what ultimately happens when you call local law enforcement. That's just a fact. I'm not saying it should change, it ought to be different, but that's just the facts. And some of the commentary and suggestions I received from putting the computer crime laws, just beefing this up is really for that, and to send the signal that this is we take security and people seriously if there is indeed a crime that it does occur in the state.
Mr. Co-Chairman?
Yes, Senator Nethercutt.
Thank you. Mr. Cornish, Is it not accurate that it is a federal matter in light of the fact that the crime crosses state lines and is also a global crime when somebody in Nigeria steals your digital assets?
Mr. Cornish.
It is indeed. However, what my redress as seeking doesn't mean that, for example, just to use the state of New York, for example, because that's the one that always comes to mind, where the nexus of a transaction can be, we've already deemed, I think, transactions being in Wyoming, people conducting business in Wyoming, availing themselves of Wyoming jurisdiction. It certainly means that Wyoming law enforcement can pursue those wrongdoers the same way that, say, the New York Attorney General would pursue somebody like BCCI overseas for conducting, for engaging in untoward activities. There's just the fact is that while federal, yes, there should be increased law enforcement in the federal realm for this, and for reasons unknown to me, others are welcome to hear it. I mean, this is just not something the FBI deals with. They don't. And I think in terms of providing the infrastructure and safety, especially in light of the fact that these banks and trust companies are going to be seeking insurance from overseas. I mean, let's face it, U.S. insurer. I can tell you for a fact that U.S. insurance companies are not going to be writing policies for trust companies and SPDIs. These entities are going to London overseas markets to find these things. And these are the kinds of questions that we have to answer in terms of talking to an underwriter, saying, what kind of law enforcement, what are your remedies in terms of what your law enforcement remedies are, in terms of what can happen if something goes wrong. It sounds superfluous on its face, but these things have real consequences in the operations and formations of businesses in this rudimentary stage that we're in right now. And these are, maybe this isn't the right way to do it, and maybe you all in your collective wisdom have a better way of doing it, but those messages need to come across so that the infrastructure and businesses you want to create here in Wyoming essentially can express to other people that there are remedies for things when they do go wrong, and that when you're going to the insurance markets, there are means by which somebody can at least pursue some form of justice.
Follow-up, Senator Cut. No, not now.
Not right now.
Coach Jim.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if this is going to be for more you, Mr. Cornish, or Senator Nethercott, but when we're talking about generalized theft statutes and how that works, and considering digital assets, I mean, how can we prove that we were in the room where it happened? Does generalized theft even contemplate that? Because when we're talking digital assets, who knows if it happened over the border? We just know that it happened, and we weren't in the room when it happened. So, I mean,
Mr. Co-Chairman, that would be. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That would be the first question a jury would be asked to decide, is whether or not a Wyoming court had jurisdiction over the defendant for where the crime occurred. So a charging document says, on or about the 5th day of May, Mr. Defendant did take the property belonging to another in the county of Laramie, state of Wyoming. If that did not occur, that person cannot be charged in the state of Wyoming with that crime. Now, there's a question about that, right? I mean, certainly the victim is there, but I would make a similar concept associated with all of you with credit cards, where your credit card number was stolen by somebody somewhere in the world. That doesn't mean the state of Wyoming can successfully investigate all of those credit card misuses of numbers, extradite those people from all over the world, and to get the $1,000 of fraudulent credit card charges that were used against you. It's just not practical. And it kind of goes with the conversation of caveat emptor associated with where we are with the industry And so requiring a small state agency with jurisdictional limitations associated with the state of Wyoming, I think, is illogical and provides a false sense of security and also probably not the level of sophistication for that criminal investigative agency, with all due respect to them, that they probably just don't have the bandwidth to investigate the theft of digital assets from overseas defendants that would intend to do financial harm to the United States and its citizens. So I applaud that, and I'm sure they would look forward the opportunity to get funding to train their small. I think the computer crime team is comprised of about 4 agents that are actual police officers with some supporting technicians associated with that. So expanding the scope of their task to do with digital currency crimes, I think, whereas they're already tasked with that statutorily, but we're requiring them to do this every time a bad actor globally wants to take action, I think is probably not the best course. So, but there's certainly a remedy to work with, keeping in mind that their primary goals are looking at intrusion cases into the state of Wyoming and child exploitation cases. And that's what their focus remains, not on the theft of people's personal property.
Thank you, Senator Nethercott.
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Olson.
I just want to jump back to a comment you made, Mr. Cornish, about the FBI. And so that is concerning, but my question is, do you know, it seems like you're at least familiar with this, do you know how many incident reports are at least made to the FBI that they don't act on? And then the other question I would have tied to that, and the only reason I ask that, not because I'm trying to pick on you, but when you say the FBI doesn't respond to it, I want to know, what does that mean, right? To back that up when you make that statement. But also, the other question I wonder is it because of the type of incident that is reported? And so dovetailing off of Co-Chairman Lindholm's question, how do we know where the act is occurring? In my mind, Representative Western and I were just talking about this. The number one place you'd probably look is the location of the server, right? And so if the server is in state of California, then maybe the FBI doesn't act on it because it would be solely within the state of California, and therefore it would be within the jurisdiction of California. So maybe that's why they don't. I don't know why they don't act on it, but if it's cross-state jurisdictional, that could potentially be why. And if so, passing this law and there are 0 servers in Wyoming holding a blockchain, what would it do?
Mr. Cornish, you have a few questions.
I'll try to hit them as best I can. I can only speak from personal experience in assisting clients. To the best of my knowledge, there is the remedy in terms of trying to swear out a report to the FBI of a theft of a digital asset is done through an office in San Francisco, California. That is done telephonically. I think if you go on the FBI website, you will find the phone number and you will dial it up and they will ask you to leave a message. That answering box has been full for the last several months. I do not believe that it is regularly monitored. I ultimately find myself trying to locate the people within the FBI to speak with. I'll ultimately talk to them. They will be very polite to me, and I will not hear from them again. Okay. Like, in terms of the thinking of all the questions you asked me, it's an incredibly frustrating red tape kind of thing to find anybody in the Fed realm, despite the fact we have people supposedly filing SARs and reports and all these things that supposedly should be triggering something at FinCEN, and whether those things go, they certainly don't reach the stage of going to a U.S. Marshal or the Justice Department directly. Maybe there's some real large things that do, but You know, if I'm a retail customer with $2 million worth of Bitcoin, I am going to be relegated to the answering machine box. I think we can, whether it's fair or not, or burdensome or not, I think Wyoming can do a little better than that. And I hope we can. And I think I think you want to hear from somebody. I want Jeremy Draws up here.
Mr. Co-Chair,
Yes, go ahead, Senator.
real briefly, have you ever advised your clients to report the crime to local law enforcement or to DCI?
I have not
Mr.
had
Cornish.
the opportunity to have anybody whose digital assets have been stolen within the state of Wyoming. I can only tell you that I've had clients call me from other states and indeed from other countries whose assets were on servers based in the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Cornish. Follow up. Yeah, please introduce yourself to the committee and share your thoughts.
Jeremy Drawl, and I'm reporting this as an individual, not as an entity. Current resident of Texas and in the industry, and from firsthand knowledge as well as what's in public domain, there are significant cases of something called SIM swapping, where employees within mobile operators are actually selling all of the secure data of individuals to hackers, which renders your identity useless, your PINs, passwords, all useless, and it's outright fraud, and the money is easily stolen as well as your whole entire identity is manipulated and taken away from you. Local law enforcement can generally take anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks to respond, if they respond at all. They don't have the capacity, as you mentioned, even in places that are major cities and technology hubs, they don't have the resources. FBI do not have the internal resources to investigate, even at losses in 7 figures. Department of Homeland Security have limited resources to investigate this, and Secret Service have limited resources to investigate this. There's a task force called REACT Task Force in Santa Barbara. Sergeant Tarazi, who has been a leader not only in the United States but globally in tracking down cases, and there are well over 1,000 cases. One that is public is Michael Turpin had over $22 million stolen all through this type of activity. So if you look at that as an individual, if you look at that as any type of activity, not just in blockchain or crypto, wealth managers, politicians, anybody out there from a cybersecurity perspective, it's tremendously risky because the operators don't have the security in place, the networks aren't secure, and from that aspect, you're vulnerable to it. Yeah, so.
Thank you. Go ahead, Senator.
Mr. Co-Chair, thank you. So I'm just trying to kind of get my arms around what's being asked and try not to take an affront of Wyoming can do better than Department of Homeland Security, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and all of the tens of billions of dollars of resources that go into those agencies. So, which none of which are going to that. That's right. I think that they're focused on, they may, if it relates to things like terrorism, right? So it may not be a direct relationship there, but certainly the priorities may look differently. But I do believe that those agencies are focused on cybercrime and understanding how all of that looks and how all of that plays in together. So it may just be the timing of the inception of this. But specifically, do you think Wyoming should stand up its own more sophisticated digital asset, digital currency, crime investigation team, recognizing that it would only have jurisdictional authority within the 4 corners of this state?
Mr. Cornish, go ahead.
I think there will come a time when such a force or such an initiative may well make sense. I'm not entirely sure it makes sense at this moment, at this time. As this industry evolves and business comes to the state, I think everybody has gone above and beyond the call to make sure that the businesses that are coming to the state are going to be working in the most compliant, secure manner they can. This really gets to the issue of whether somebody here in Wyoming or a business here in Wyoming is going to have somebody who's actually going to do something, whether it's as modest as it can be with the limited resources that the state has. I think it's important to know, and I think it's important, and I know it's important to people that I've spoken in the insurance industry.
Mr. Co-Chair,
Go ahead, call it.
I believe your testimony is you have no facts to support that the state of Wyoming hasn't done anything. None of your clients have reported any of those crimes or those concerns to any Wyoming law enforcement agency.
That's correct.
So there's no testimony before this committee that the state of Wyoming has failed to act in any capacity regarding any of these concerns within the state of Wyoming.
That is correct. And by the way, I would like to just to clarify the comment that Wyoming can do better. I think you understand the context in which I meant that. That was not to say that we were taking an undercut at the good people in law enforcement. I have a relative in my family who is very involved in that area. That's not certainly what I meant. I meant it in an almost, if I was being sarcastic, I apologize. But given the leadership of Wyoming in the blockchain area, I sincerely believe that we can do better than a federal government that seems to brush aside or ignore the whole digital asset community. And for better or for worse, some of it includes some untoward things people do. And we just have to recognize that.
I was trying to find the number online a moment ago and can't find it. So it's kudos to you for finding a telephone number, even if it went straight to voicemail. Did you have any follow-up? Okay. Did you want to answer that question? Please,
Yeah, I would like to respond one
Yes.
other way. The REACT task force and how they got involved in it is because there was no other resources for people, and there was an arrest that was made there. It was published, and people started to gravitate towards them, and they literally, as local enforcement, connected the dots nationally with the federal. And so I personally do think that as great as all of Wyoming has done, to also be able to take that leadership in having a point of view and resources to be able to assist the businesses and individuals here for it would be welcomed.
Thank you. Representative Western, I believe you had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Corning, if you allow me just to maybe back up on a macro picture. So since the advent of cryptocurrencies and how they've become really popular, we've seen some really high-profile thefts of tens of millions of dollars of digital assets. I mean, huge sums. What's been the recourse? I mean, I would like to think that such high-profile cases would have, kind of spotted investigation, stuff like that. I mean, both at a civil level and criminal. So maybe you could address that and what actions have been taken in the light of those events.
Mr. Cornish, go ahead.
There are certainly actions that the SEC and the CFTC have taken from people who have purloined digital assets. There have been criminal prosecutions of people, some of them in absentia, when people have been found to have had a nexus overseas. For example, if I find a Ukrainian who has, I think North Dakota actually has had a couple, if I'm not mistaken. If there is a Ukrainian, for example, who has stolen assets out of a server somewhere in the United States, that person can be, if the tracing is done to that person or to that address, they can certainly prosecute that person. People are, there is litigation out there on theft. There's a lot of litigation on SIM swapping cases where digital assets have been stolen. There are plenty of people who are out there who have had the unfortunate instance of being hacked, whether it's overseas or elsewhere. Those have resulted in lawsuits, civil actions. To the best of my knowledge, no operator of an exchange or a depository of digital assets has been criminally prosecuted for aiding and abetting or being or negligently assisting in the theft of assets. It's relatively new. People are somewhat like most criminals. People engaged in financial crimes. Some of them are difficult to find. Some of them are, and of course, a lot of them there are collection issues. People who tend to steal money tend to use it very quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Cornish. Any follow-up, Representative? Good. All right. Committee?
Mr. Chairman?
Ms. Long.
The SIM swap discussion, I think we'll come back to in the identity point, because that is much broader than cryptocurrency, and it is shocking how the telecommunications companies have no security on our passwords, and the individuals in the stores they have access to all of our passwords. This is one of the big reasons why we have a lot of hacking, and it goes well beyond cryptocurrency. So that is on our agenda. We can discuss that later. I'm with Senator Nethercott on this. I think the question is, do we need to be so specific on this? In our conversation back in May, it was verifying that indeed the theft statutes actually covered this. And I think by defining digital assets as property, that the theft statutes actually do cover this. And I think one question, though, and maybe, Mr. Chairman, if I could direct this to Senator Nethercott, in SF 125 last year, we actually broadened the jurisdiction for UCC purposes to deem digital assets to be located in Wyoming if they are custodied by a Wyoming custodian, if the server or the hardware is in Wyoming, or if it's a Wyoming resident. So I am almost wondering whether there isn't something that could be done with regard to the criminal jurisdiction that would give our court system explicit jurisdiction, because UCC is civil. I don't know if that's ever persuasive. But it is kind of cool how we're taking on the issue, which is these are intangible assets, and it is something that is very difficult for law enforcement to grapple with. Who's got jurisdiction? And so if we just explicitly give jurisdiction, it may be enough.
Senator Nethercott, thoughts?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. The question typically is to determine criminal jurisdiction is where did the crime occur? So where did the crime occur when the cryptocurrency was stolen? We know where the victim was located at the time. Maybe they're summer residents, maybe they're winter residents. We know where the defendant might have been located at the time, Ukraine. Where did the crime occur? Right? This is an area of the law that obviously we're all grappling with globally, recognizing that every country in the world is trying to understand where these crimes are occurring when they're happening on the internet, right? When they're happening on a computer system. And so that's the piece. Is it possible that those crimes could be charged within the state of Wyoming? It is. I think realistically the challenge is more pragmatic, associated with investigating those pieces, and the ability to get the evidence that you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt in a courtroom is more challenging, of identifying who the actor is behind the computer, right, in the Ukraine. Who is that person? We can identify maybe an IP address, we can maybe identify it in other ways, but who was really behind the computer at the crime in the Ukraine, right? And then even if we do, which would be miraculous, right, how do we extradite them back? And is it worth it? And recognizing that the crime charged might be quite difficult to prove. So I think it's just those realistic challenges associated with a successful investigation and prosecution of where we want to ask ourselves as a country, where we want our law enforcement focusing their resources on. Do we want them investigating terrorism, or do we want them investigating financial crimes, recognizing that the two are closely connected? But that's primarily it. It's much easier to trace the elements of the bomb as opposed to who was behind the computer at the time the digital currency was taken, for lack of a better word. Right?
And Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, Mr. Cornish.
I would tend to agree with Caitlin, Ms. Long's suggestion that, especially given the fact that, in terms of the UCC jurisdiction, especially given the fact that, Senator Netticott, you've expressed that the judiciary is already working on revision of the theft statutes. Maybe this is not the place to do it, but it's certainly there certainly needs to be some consideration by those in judiciary that with the advent of blockchain and the development of these businesses that are going to be coming to the state, that there needs to be some jurisdictional nexus that participants in this industry are going to be able to have at their disposal, whether it's to find a civil remedy or to pursue criminal prosecution. And I think the intention of this, this is maybe not the right vehicle for it, but the intent of making sure that people have that ability, and it's clear, just like we all did in the UCC, that's there. And that's all.
Thank you, Mr. Cornish. Any further questions? Any follow-up?
Mr. Chairman, may I briefly, this is a little unusual, but there is someone from the FBI who used to be the FBI Cyber Crimes Division sitting in the audience. I wonder whether you might have a view on this. Would you be willing to testify? Am I allowed to ask that question, Mr. Chairman?
Well, we're still open for public testimony. If you'd like to encourage someone from the public to testify, that is not unheard of. We can do that. Thank you both for your testimony. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So with that, we are open for public testimony. Would anyone else like to join us for public testimony? The answer may be no, which is fine. Yeah, go ahead. Come on up. Okay. And Byron, are you interested in testifying also? Okay, so just so that we know where we're at. Okay, thank you. Please state your name and welcome to the task force.
Hi, thanks. My name is Curtis Ting. I work for Kraken, part of the compliance practice there. I previously worked for the FBI for the last almost 8 years prior to joining Kraken. And so I want to say that any comments here would be slightly dated, and I don't want to speculate on what the current situation is. But I will say that even as of when I departed a year and a half ago or so, the FBI was trying to move away from voicemails and the phone, which is why they set up the Internet Crime Complaint Center, IC3, which is intended to report on tips and leads as it relates to primarily fraud-related incidents on the internet, as well as theft. The reality is, I would echo the previous commenters' statements about the limits of federal resources. It's tough to figure out what the theft volume threshold really is to trigger an investigation. You've got a typical agent's caseload of between 8 to 10 cases at any given time, so the volumes have to be pretty big. That said, there is significant interest on the part of the Bureau as well as some of the other agencies in trying to focus a little bit more on developing investigations in this regard. We're aware, and Kraken is looking at participating in a digital currency crimes working group that's been set up by the FBI, the U.S. Marshal Service, REACT, HSI, and the IRS. And so, these are conversations that are happening. As will be surprised to nobody, the federal level is slow to respond, but there is definitely interest and movement. So I wouldn't quite echo the sort of dire picture that's been here.
Ms. Long, go ahead, follow up.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ting, thank you for that. And sorry for putting you on the spot. I'm very interested in your view on this specific question. Do you think this bill adds anything? In other words, as a company that's looking at coming into Wyoming, do you think this would be helpful to you? Would it help you get insurance? Do we need this? Because you've got a unique perspective.
Go ahead.
I'll be totally honest. I don't want to overspeak with respect to this. We haven't studied this particular bill's text yet, so I may have to do that.
Thank you. Sorry for putting you on the spot. Thank you, Mr.
No
Chairman.
I have a quick question for you, if you'll stay for 1 second, and maybe the rest of the committee does as well. No worries. I'm just curious, if someone steals outright $1 million, if Senator Nethercott has $1 million sitting in her living room, and I steal that $1 million. Is that crime going to be in, well, I need her to be in another state probably, or something, make it a federal crime. That's going to rise to the level of being investigated, right? I mean, that will certainly have an investigation. Is that,
By the
is that fair
FBI
to say?
specifically?
Yeah, I need to make it a federal crime somehow, but it's a $1 million crime, clear federal violation.
To be perfectly frank, that's up to each field office's discretion.
Okay.
$1 million may be very large for the Omaha office,
Okay.
but may not be particularly consequential for the New York office. And so that's strictly left to the discretion of the field offices.
Do you think it's more or less likely, though, if it's $1 million worth of a digital asset, that it would be investigated? And is part of that just the likelihood of actually getting to a prosecution?
I'm sorry, I don't mean to evade, but I know that if I was still working with the FBI, I wouldn't be allowed to answer that question with respect to whether investigations are ongoing or whether they're triggered. But I certainly will say that there's significant interest. I'm aware of, my former colleagues, and we're still in discussions about how to advance investigations when it comes to digital currency crimes. There's significant interest in making sure that we have some precedents set.
Great, thank you. Any further questions? Thank you for your time. Other public testimony, we actually have a couple, and I will invite you up in a second, but I know Byron's been standing for a minute. Byron, if you want to join us. Please state your name for the record, and welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Byron Odekoven, the Executive Director for the Wyoming Sheriffs and Chiefs, offering a little comment, if you will, on the structure and the makeup of the bill and where we might be at. And I'm listening with great intrigue to the overall discussion of theft of currency nationally, internationally, and where the example of where the Rollins Police Department might end up in that initial discussion or called into question to help solve the Ukrainian bad guy. Bringing back for prosecution is a little intriguing around the edges, to say the least. I view this as kind of a discussion in its infancy, because we're not sure how this will play. We're not sure how the international law will set, not sure how the federal agencies' response, not sure how they will be as an asset to locals, or the state would be an asset to the locals as well. So I think for purposes of our discussion to start with, as we look at, is the theft covered generally? And then who might we point to start that discussion to get it to the next level and back? So that's where I would like to tailor my general comments from. And that would be to start with, and I think the work last year helped to define what digital media / digital assets are. And I guess the first question I have is, do we need to add the word blockchain to what I hope we already defined last year? If the answer is yes, then most of the bill is not necessary. If the answer is no, we may need to revisit the idea of a digital asset to ensure that tomorrow's definition is included in today, so that the theft of tomorrow, we can say, we're talking about a digital asset. Because we've generally prided ourselves in terms of statutory construction that if I steal something from you, it's against the law. So the question is, do we have that something relatively defined well enough to ensure that it is covered and thus subject to investigation? So I think the staff comment of how is this distinguished from other thefts is an important starting premise. And so I would offer that we may need to discuss the initial construct from last year to ensure that it's included would be good. The process of stealing it, the blockchain, if you will, how you would contact the server, how you would extricate that data, how you would fraudulently do it is part of that crime of the theft of that asset. So is how I'm parsing the issue ever so slightly, and would suggest that while I don't necessarily have a 100% answer, that's the question that needs to be addressed in some manner through this and through the staff. The second piece, having said that, that takes care of quite a bit of the bill, if you will. Page 8, the word shall, I think the good senator in her discussion of the enabling statutes and legislation. DCI is considered a support investigation agency with exception. So the county attorney, county and prosecuting attorney, district attorney requests DCI to do the investigation, or law enforcement requests DCI to do the investigation, except in the areas of the statute where you've identified the word shall, which indicates that they have primary jurisdiction, which means a member of the public can call and say, I have this child pornography on my computer, what do I do now? And that would be kind of the discussion here. I've had a theft of an asset, what should I do now? Who are you the right person to call? And thus it is the word shall. Because there's only 4 instances where you added the word shall, and child pornography is one of those sections. So I use that because that is one of the sections where DCI has that enabling jurisdiction to be able to do. So it's not that they would be the primary, so to speak, it's just that they would then be able to do that. Now, as we move forward, it's important, and I think it's already been borne out in part of the discussion this morning, is the skill set, the expertise, the funding, the budget, the manpower, as we move this forward is certainly something that you would need to be cognizant of and recognize, looking at the expertise and all of those abilities to be able to do that investigation. And that comes through the budgetary process, both in manpower allocation, both in funds for training, both in funds for investigation, and that critical nature back and forth between the two. So it would certainly be of issue both locally for cities, towns, and counties, as well as the state, in terms of moving this kind of program forward and thus having some assurances that we'd be able to do some of those investigations. It struck me as I was listening that this may also be an opportunity for you to pose questions of our congressional delegation in terms of support and what are they looking at in terms of support federally to be able to assist in blockchain style theft investigation, both at a seemingly local level, but more importantly across the United States and across the world globally. And I have an opportunity at the end of this week to visit with our Denver Regional FBI SAC for a period of time on Thursday, and I'm going to use that as an opportunity to at least seek a little have we, do we, could we, can we, and are you thinking about kind of a discussion, and it will be interesting to hear based on our discussion today what that answer might be.
Great.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Mr. Oderkoven. Any questions for Mr. Oderkoven? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. All right, we're slightly behind schedule. I want to take all public testimony, but I just want to be make a point of let's be concise with the public testimony and try not to be redundant with previous testimony, but anything that is new or a different point of view, please provide that to the committee. And with that, please join us. Welcome back to Wyoming, and welcome back to the task force. Please introduce yourselves to the committee.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I'm Joseph Pitluck with Free Range.
Amber Terrazas with Free Range, Chairman, committee members. Thank you.
Yes, I just have a quick comment on who we're going up against. The types of groups that are a threat to Wyoming digital asset institutions. I'll give an example of one. North Korea's Apps 38. They are a regime-backed group dedicated to hacking financial institutions. They're linked to a North Korean military group called the Reconnaissance General Bureau. Their primary targets are financial institutions. They favor long planning, where they have extended periods of access to compromised victim environments. They carefully conduct reconnaissance within compromised financial institutions. They're not smash and grab. They'll spend 6 months or more quietly infiltrating your systems. And it's not just financial institutions that they attack. Their secondary targets are also financial regulators and media organizations. And I just want to bring this up because these are the types of players that we're going to be going against. It's no longer us talking about small volume exchanges here. If we're incorporating digital assets into our Wyoming institutions, we're going to go up against some very serious state-sponsored actors.
Thank you. Questions? Well, I'll ask, do you think this legislation helps? I mean, in the situation that you're discussing, I would want to be hiring a third party, a private sector counter security entity that spends all of its time making sure that my servers are not infiltrated and looking out for exactly the types of actors you're talking about. So I'm curious, do you feel that this legislation is helpful from your business's perspective, is inconsequential, or just we should be aware of this and try and do our best? What are your thoughts?
Mr. Chairman, it's difficult for me to address the specifics of the bill.
Yeah.
I know, Amber, you've looked at it a bit, but I believe that all of us here in this room need to work together. We need to circle up the wagons. I believe united we stand, divided we fall when it comes to these larger actors that will be trying to infiltrate our systems.
Great, thank you. Further questions or discussion? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Appreciate it.
I'm sorry, I have a comment.
Go ahead,
Well,
Amber.
Separate,
Absolutely.
so it's a separate topic. Thank you, Chairman. Members of the board again. I just wanted to bring up on page 6-3-504. We're talking about trespass, and this is more of a legal clarification, nothing huge, but we're talking about, the tort of trespass on a chattel. So within that section, I don't really see interfere, which I think we see access a computer system, computer network. But if you see the elements of the tort, there's actually interference in the element.
Thank you. Yeah, I see what you're suggesting. Did we have that on the previous page? Interruption or impairment is 63503 on page 5. But that's government operations and public services, so we may not. Thank you. And this is previously written statute from 4 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. We put this legislation together. But
Yeah, so it was just more of a clarification because one of the elements doesn't require actual damage.
Okay.
I just wanted to be clear.
Great, thank you. Good. All right, thank you both.
Thank you.
Any additional public testimony at this time, please come up and reintroduce yourself for those that are watching.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Emma Channing. I represent Consensus. My words are my own. I want to go over just some very basic things that I think have got skipped over. Firstly, a SIM port or transfer is only a problem if you're using your phone and SMS to secure your assets. No one running a large institution would recommend that you are doing that and keeping stuff in hot storage. So generally speaking, best practice is cold storage secured by a hardware device like YubiKey or something like it. So SIM porting and SIM transfers are, genuinely speaking, tend to hit a lower level dollar value issue. The specifics of a SIM transfer, which are the most common form at the moment, is this. Someone walks into a AT&T store. They have a fake driver's license that looks like them. And they usually have a baby with them or some kind of way to socially hack the person who's at the store. And they ask for the SIM to be transferred onto the device that they have in their hand. Now, where this becomes very challenging is actually this is usually within the United States. It quite often is in the same state as you are personally resident. So it may well actually be within the state of Wyoming's jurisdiction. From there, it will rapidly become a wider hack, often involving other states, often involving other international states.
should Wyoming be responsible for getting involved in trying to address extraterritorial issues? No. Is the FBI sat on its hands? No. FBI tends to not investigate very broadly frauds under 500K. And as previous testimony has indicated, there is some flexibility there. But they have been, for example, going after people, seeking people who have suffered the Quadriga CX hack. So there is quite a lot of activity there. The only thing I would say is that it can be incredibly difficult if you are experiencing a SIM transfer to persuade the cell phone company that you know that you have, because the only thing that you will know about is that you have zero reception on your phone. And usually what you'll be told when you phone in is to just reset your phone. It is almost impossible to fix that information gap, but again, I would question whether that is Wyoming's responsibility rather than something that should be addressed at a federal legislative level.
Excellent. Any questions for Ms. Channing? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Any further public testimony on 2020 LSO 57 draft 0.5? Seeing none, public testimony is closed. Committee, what's your pleasure? Is there a motion? Going once, going twice. All right, we will. Yes, Mr. Co-Chairman?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. But I would maybe at the next, I don't know if the Judiciary Committee will be meeting between now and our next task force meeting in September. No, maybe in the future we can take an update from Chairman Nethercott in regards to if that's included or if we need a well-placed amendment during session in that bill.
Senator Nethercott, thoughts? Good.
I think that's appropriate, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I think the crime of theft currently as written in our statute addresses this crime. And I anticipate that any future crime of theft will also include this particular type of crime. So whatever property you may have, whatever it looks like, if it has value and you take it and it doesn't belong to you, that's theft.
All right. Thank you, Senator Nethercott. So clearly right now in statute, we have a lot of protection. And just to clarify for those that might not understand, all of the sections that exist beginning on page 3 at the bottom and moving forward are already original jurisdiction for our DCI. So the changes, we're adding blockchain explicitly, but if you have a computer hacking style crime, DCI already has original jurisdiction, and honestly a lot of the additions of blockchain are probably superfluous. So I think Senator Nethercott is certainly correct that we're already well protected in the state, and if there is anything else we can do through the revisions, I think Senator Nethercott's going to take care of that for us. Any further discussion on the computer crimes legislation? Ms. Long?
Mr. Chairman, since we heard conversations about the SIM swapping, should we cover that now, or would you prefer to wait until later? We do not have proposed legislation in our package for it yet.
Yeah, I think let's save that for later and try and stick with the agenda, because I do think it'll come up under the identity discussion, which we've got ahead of us on the agenda. Representative. Oh, yeah, that's Western. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess my hesitation with the bill was that it certainly sounded like a lot of it was just lack of resources. It sounded like DCI, et cetera. They have the authority to pursue some of this stuff, but I think a lot of law enforcement agencies, it had more to do with having the staff on hand, the enforcement on hand, and the resources to really go after this kind of stuff, whether it be within the state, interstate, or across national boundaries. So that was kind of seems like this can be solved outside the confines of this bill, whether it be with funding from the federal level or from the state, to give DCI the adequate resources to go after this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative, I agree. I think it is a bit of a chicken and egg problem. Once we have a significant nexus here and there are justifications for additional resources and investigations in the state of Wyoming, then we need to remedy our resources. But I think they have the jurisdiction, we don't necessarily have the expertise to be competing with the FBI on these. But if we get to the point where there's enough demands, so to speak, which will be unfortunate, but certainly a likely future if we continue to grow in this sector, then we may need to channel further resources. Senator Nethercott.
Mr. Co-Chairman, just so you know, I mean, I've heard the concerns and hear the potential here to really create a reputation for Wyoming to not only be diversifying the economy, but also to take the lead on criminal investigations of these. As we have done, Wyoming has been on the forefront of actual computer crimes in the world. Something for this body to know. Wyoming is very much in the lead on that and will hopefully continue to be. But with that, there's different concepts associated with financial crime. And so one thing to be mindful of is that there is an agent with the Division of Criminal Investigation that is assigned to the Medicaid Fraud Division of the Attorney General's Office. I see that kind of concept being applicable here to having a very sophisticated agent being assigned to perhaps the Department of Banking or the Department of Insurance as we navigate this growing industry to see where that level of sophisticated expertise may be specialized as associated with kind of the general crimes that we think of law enforcement investigating. So there is the ability to have that flexibility within the agency already, and I anticipate those conversations to continue.
Agreed. Thank you, Senator. Further discussion on this legislation before we move on? Seeing none. The next and probably last action before going to lunch will be discussion of private cryptographic keys, 20 LSO 163. Tamara, is that back to you? Aha, all right. See, I got confident and was wrong.
Unfortunately, you have to hear from me.
Ian.
Mr. Chairman, this bill is the result of the committee's discussion at its last meeting on private keys. And it was a fairly broad discussion about what happens when the private key gets tied up in a dispute for its underlying asset. And it's an issue that becomes complicated quickly because it's as complicated as all the underlying assets that a private key might give you access, and the variety of ways that a private key can be used, which is innumerable as well. And so this bill is a broad attempt to announce the rule that the task force asked for, and that is that when we're talking about a dispute of the underlying asset, the private key is not going to be subject to being considered a separate digital asset or declaring separate interests in those underlying assets. The bill is fairly straightforward. It provides references an existing definition of private keys. And then in the section of the law that was created last year defining what digital assets are, it's an appropriate place to say what isn't a digital asset, and that's why it's placed here. It adds a new paragraph 4, and that's the language on page 5 of this bill, between lines 4 and 8. And the paragraph is divided up into 2 sections. The first language in that paragraph basically is the limiting language, as it says we're not talking about all private keys. We're talking about private keys where the underlying assets are in dispute. So for any matter relating to a digital asset, other interest or right to which a private key provides access, the private key shall not constitute a digital asset, interest, or right separate from the asset, interest, or right to which the key provides access. That's a wordy way of, again, saying that the issue, the private key will not be considered separate, but only for circumstances when those underlying assets, the assets to which the digital key provides access, are in dispute. It's a fairly broad approach. I think the task force needs to continue to consider how digital keys can be used and the types of disputes that their underlying assets are subject. I think that this handles a bankruptcy. It handles a divorce potentially. I mean, but it's also a broad rule. It says it's going to this is the rule anytime the underlying assets are at issue. And so I think that the task force would be wise to continue to consider that how broad that is and whether it needs to have additional.
Excellent, thank you. Committee, any questions for Mr. Shaw? Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so just to catch me up to speed, so essentially what we're saying, Ian, is we're saying that that this private key is not an asset, aka it's not property unto itself.
Right. Not an asset separate from the assets to which it provides access. That's correct.
So it's not an asset separate from which the asset that it's tied to. So what would be considered if not an asset then at that point?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think that's a very good question. And in fact, you maybe led me right into one suggestion I have for the language that's been created here. On line 7, it says, the private key shall not constitute a digital asset, interest, or right separate from the assets, its underlying assets. I think perhaps that language, which I'm at fault for because I drafted it, but the right itself is maybe going too far. And I would suggest to the task force, because a key is always going to, or is going to grant a separate right. That is a right of access. And we really don't want to go that broadly. I would suggest that language probably simply say, the private key shall not constitute a digital asset or interest separate from the asset, interest, or rights to which the key provides access. Because you're right. I mean, it gets very complicated quickly about what the nature of a key is and how it relates to its underlying assets. I think we need to be careful in the language.
Right, thank you. Additional discussion on this? The discussion we had at the last committee meeting, and we've had it in the past, is this idea that based on the nature of private keys, there's a lot more to the key potentially than whatever an individual underlying asset is. This may be a key that opens a lot of doors. And so having the key be a requirement in a transaction, you must turn the key over. You may be turning over too much, whereas the asset that needs to be something which could be subject to court scrutiny or a court order, whatever else needs to be taking place. But the key itself isn't necessarily an asset that can be commanded or ordered. So I think this language gets us to that discussion point that we had last time very well. We'll go to public testimony next, but committee, any further thoughts on this language or any questions for staff before we get to public testimony, or honestly any concerns with the way this is drafted? I think we should try and vet that now.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the discussion with Ian, I think it gets to the point in regards to we're not going too overly broad if we strike or right on line 7.
Senator Nethercott.
I think that's appropriate to strike that language or right. And recognizing that this bill will likely come to my committee, I just want to make sure that we fully discuss this concept. I understand why we're putting it in statute. I just want to make sure we don't confuse the issue more broader. At the time of discussing it in Jackson, I questioned whether or not it was necessary because I thought a fair analogy was a safe deposit box. And so the safe deposit box being the key and the contents inside are different than the box. And so is that not the same here, that particular analogy? Or a cell phone is not your email and text messaging. It's a cell phone. It's different than the content on it. And so do we really need to delineate that in statute, or are we complicating the situation further? I just want to anticipate dealing with these questions in my committee with members of this committee here and also the lawyers in the room to just see how we lawyers might muck this up moving down the road.
Senator Nethercott, I think one of the differences, and it's not always the case, it might in a lot of circumstances be identical to a safety deposit box, or a safe deposit box, if you have a unique key situation. But the difference here can be if my safe deposit box key also opens my car and my home and a few other assets, which is commonplace, unfortunately, with private keys. That's where we get into the difficulty. And there may be other nuances here. I know Christopher Allen was one of the advocates, and I don't think he's here yet, but he's going to be here tomorrow. Chairman.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think there's merit in moving down the road with something like this because this is essentially a defining aspect for our judiciary when it comes to how assets are to be handled. And is there merit in ensuring that our judiciary understands what's what? Could there be a court case, I guess, in the future or some type of bankruptcy issue where a judge orders that one individual is awarded said assets and the other individual is getting the keys? I mean, that just complicates things and makes them far more. I can't imagine something like that happening, but it would be stressful to say the least. But the fact that we're defining, ensuring that these are not an asset unto themselves, I think is a good point to make that we could make to the Judiciary Committee, just saying this is not an asset and we need to define the difference.
Would the court ever say hand over the safe deposit box key, as opposed to, like that's an important part of it, as opposed to the contents of the safe deposit box? Do you see a necessity for the court to make that choice?
Not in reality, no, because, Mr. Chairman, prior to that occurring, there would have been a conversation about there's other items in the safe deposit box that this person is not entitled to. My wife is only entitled to the cash, not the gold, right?
Right.
So that's,
which is common of my safe deposit box also. I have that. I have that quandary.
Right. So that's the conversation. So before that kind of carte blanche authority would be granted, there already would have been a dialogue about what those contents are, and then I would only see, I think the concern we heard from the last committee meeting was the contents or what is stored behind the key doesn't want to be revealed, and as I indicated then, that's just not a reality if you find yourself in a judicial system where a court will have the authority to order the disclosure of that information of whatever is behind the key. And so the ability to protect that just really isn't there. I think it's important. I think the bill is, I'm kind of neutral to it. I see its relevance. I just worry about its practical application and maybe providing more confusion as a result of the same conversation we're having now that a court may get itself into as well. Because again, the concept is quite simple in reality. We deal with these things all the time where there's the safety deposit box itself, there's the key to the safety deposit box. The court is never authorizing the wife gets the key to the box. She gets whatever value is in the box, right? Because that's what people really care about is the value in the box.
The key itself ties into identity in this realm also, which is unique from safe deposit box. I can be identified by, I'll have a public key and a private key. I know my private key that gets access to assets potentially, but it also allows for somebody to then be me digitally, or just to sign off as me. I could make changes to that, but it's still complicated. So I do think there's a difference moving forward with the digital identity that is not contemplated by a standard locking. All right, any other discussion, committee? Yeah, Mr. Kaufman.
Mr. Chairman, I might be in the minority on this. I actually am going to speak in favor of this bill because I have been part of a number of efforts now to draft contracts with respect to how we're going to move cryptocurrency on behalf of someone. And I think trying to define the key access and control of the key is a critical element of that. And it's to use your safety deposit box example, it's no different than giving a judge the ability to order someone to use the key to the safety deposit box to open it to allow access. In the same way, we need to have the ability and remedy at law for someone to be specifically ordered to do something with the key. And so I think this distinction could be very helpful. I don't think it's absolutely critical, but I could see this being very, very helpful in that context. So I would speak for it.
Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Yeah, and it kind of triggered.
Are you triggered?
I'm not triggered. There is a significant amount of motion towards how the judiciary is describing private keys that is currently happening, even in the whole situation with I don't know any other way to say it besides fake Toshi. The individual out there claiming that there
are other ways to say that, but go ahead.
I like calling a spade a spade.
No, I don't know any other way to say it.
That individual has been ordered to show private keys.
Yeah.
So is it an asset at that point? And that's really an interesting situation here. I triggered Will. Go ahead.
I think, Mr. Co-Chairman, if I may, and to Ms. Long, who I heard maybe comment on that, there's a difference between showing the key and being required under a court order to show the key and transferring the asset itself, right? Or transferring the key. So, I mean, and I haven't read those cases that you're referring to, but I guess that's my piece here, is that there's a major distinction between a court ordering access to the key to see what it shows, to see what's inside, essentially, as opposed to this now belongs to someone else.
Mr. Chairman?
Ms. Long, go ahead.
I think what's interesting in this instance is that the key is so closely intertwined with the asset, much more so than in the physical world example of a safe deposit box. Or if somebody's refusing to allow in a divorce settlement a certain security in a brokerage account to be transferred, the court can compel the third party, Schwab or Morgan Stanley, to remove that asset and transfer it, right? But in this instance, they cannot, because the private key is the only way to access it. It's so close to the asset, yet we don't want exactly that situation where a judge compels someone to reveal a private key, because there are so many other things associated with it that may not even have been revealed. In other words, an airdrop or a fork associated with that specific key, that the moment that's revealed in a court, it's useless, because everyone can go and steal the assets associated with it. I think where Chris Allen was going originally was that he didn't want that situation. And by distinguishing between the underlying asset and the key itself, that we prohibit the situation effectively where a judge compels someone to reveal a private key.
Yes, go ahead, Senator Wilson.
Mr. Chairman, I just think this is a perfect discussion right now, because if we're trying to understand what this bill is actually doing, I think what Senator Nethercott is talking about, and with Caitlin's concerns and the concerns that were voiced to us that are the genesis of the bill, I don't think you're ever going to produce a bill that's going to provide a blanket, essentially, protection order, which is what the public is asking for. The public is saying we don't want anyone to be able to see what's on the key. That's not going to happen, because the judge may not. You may be able to prevent the judge from handing it over in a divorce as an asset. But what Senator Nethercott is talking about is the judge is always going to have the ability to open up that key and look at it. And if you compare it to anything else, they already have that. So don't drop the security box, but think about a bank account. The judge can absolutely compel to see the bank account records, see the bank account number. So I want to point that out, because if the purpose of this bill is literally to prevent eyes from seeing what's on the key, this isn't going to do it. And I'm not sure that you're ever going to craft a bill that's going to stop the judge from doing that. Now, all of that being said, you have remedies such as a protection order. So you can argue in that case, whatever it may be, that whatever is on that key should not be seen by the public, should not be seen in the courtroom, maybe not part of the record. We have court redaction rules. Redacts things from, even once they occur in the trial, you can go back and redact the transcript, remove things from the transcript. I mean, so there are lots of protections built in for the individual, but I just want to be real clear. If the purpose of this is to prevent eyes from seeing it, you're not there. That's not what's happening.
Additional discussion?
Mr. Co-Chair?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, that's the communication I've been making since Jackson, of there is no way to prevent a court from not getting access to what's on that passkey. And that's just a reality. What happens with the assets that are behind that passkey, that's a whole different story. That's what the litigation's actually about. But the court will be able to compel, through whatever means necessary, the information stored within that passkey. And as Representative Olson has pointed out, this is nothing new under the sun. I mean, the judiciary has dealt with very confidential, sensitive information from the beginning of time, of data worth significant sums of money. including information relating to national security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Think of any type of significant commercial transaction or pharmaceutical litigation where the chemical makeup of pills are in dispute and litigation is commencing. You know, that's the secret sauce, and nobody wants to share that. And so there's lots of protections in place in order to ensure that that information is not revealed. And so this is a concept the judiciary is familiar with, but to be clear to the audience to what the significance of this bill is, it is not that it will not provide those protections. It's just simply providing clarity to a new concept that we have in society to ensure it's treated accurately based on what it is, as opposed to what it is not.
Other discussion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
I actually like the broadness of the bill because if all it's doing is distinguishing between the assets and the private key itself, I think it accomplishes what it's supposed to accomplish. Of course, if someone wants to see everything that's within that private key, they could be compelled to do so. What all it's saying is that like there are uses of a private key that are different than the digital assets, and that being compelled to like hand over the private key could be akin to like handing over your identity or something like that. So you have to differentiate between the private key and the assets that it contains. And to Mr. Lindholm's point, in the case that's going on with Fake Toshi, I think you said was the case. They're trying to provide evidence of like a counterfactual type thing where he's saying he has assets. The private key would be the only way to prove that he has those assets, but he doesn't have the private key, apparently.
In that instance, though, couldn't he use the private key to sign something as opposed to disclosing the private key?
Absolutely.
So in that case,
Trivially.
there's no need to
hand over the private key.
Hand over the private key because I can sign it, make that public, and verifiably true that I had access to the private key.
Exactly.
All right.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
In favor of this bill, I think we didn't try to prohibit a judge from compelling a private key, but to be perfectly honest, if I were in that situation, I would probably refuse to provide it. If I had a lot of assets tied up to it, it is permanently compromised the moment you share it, period. So what we've done here is to separate that concept so that the judge can compel you to turn over the asset, but not compel you to turn over the key.
Well, and I think that Senator Nethercott's certainly right. We're not prohibiting with this legislation a court from doing that. We're just making it clear that they're two different concepts, and we're not taking the extra step to try and say, and you shall not do this, which is probably, at least in my view, our best approach right now. I don't know that we'd want to go further. This is a good step. Senator Nethercott, anything? Anyone else at this time before we take public testimony? All right. With that, we'll open for public testimony. This public testimony is between now and lunch. So I would encourage it to be pithy. Please, though. Floor is open. Everyone's just happy with what we're doing? Excellent. All right. Public testimony is closed. Back to the committee. What's your pleasure?
Move the bill.
Bill has been moved first by Representative Lindholm, and
second.
I'll assume that's a second by Ms. Long. Committee, let's work the bill. It's a short bill, so I'll open it up to see if there's any amendments.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, go
May
ahead.
I propose Ian's amendment on page 5, lines 7 and 8, to amend it so that it reads asset or interest separate from the asset or interest to which the key provides access. In other words, striking the words or right that appear on both line 7 and 8.
All right, we have a motion. Is there a second? Got a motion and a second. Any discussion? Are you comfortable with that, Senator Nethercott? Go ahead.
Mr. Co-Chair, I support the motion. I just want to make sure it reads properly. So could we have LSO read it back and make sure that they agree with what it states?
Okay, go ahead, Ian.
Mr. Chairman, I'll bring up a point there as well. On line 5 on that same page, it does also include the word right. So if we're going to get rid of the right, that would be an appropriate place to do it as well. So 3 different places in that paragraph. So then it would read, for any matter relating to a digital asset, other interest, or other interest to which a private key provides access, the private key shall not constitute a digital asset or interest separate from the assets or interests to which the key provides access. Simply taking away the word "or right."
Excellent. I assume that's a friendly modification, Ms. Long?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
All right, second's good with it.
Question.
Question, is there any discussion before we go to the question? Seeing none, all in favor say aye on the amendment.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The amendment has carried. We're
Question.
back on the bill. Is there any
Question.
further discussion or amendments? Seeing none, question's been called. Roll call, please, Ian.
Senator Nethercott. Senator Driscoll.
Aye.
Representative Olson. Representative Ian is excused. Representative Western. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Ms. Long.
Aye.
Mr. Kaufman. Co-Chairman Lindholm.
Aye.
Co-Chairman Rothfuss.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Excellent. All right, committee, is there any further discussion before we break for lunch? All right, is there anyone from the public who will not be back this afternoon that has any public comment that they want to briefly talk about before lunch? They will not be back this afternoon. Seeing none, we are adjourned for lunch until, what do we want to call